Hello and welcome back. My name is Shannon and I'm the owner and creator here at Knotted Threads Co. I'd like to introduce you to my latest PDF pattern called the Pisces Pack. The Pisces Pack is not a standalone pattern. It is a jam-packed 98 pages worth of an add-on pack for the Aries crossbody. So back at the end of 2023, I decided to make a couple simple, sort of minimalist style bags for a drop that I was doing. And so I took the Aries and I took the shapes of the Aries and I turned it into just a bag with a single zipper on the top versus the original 2 zippers on top of the Aries with that center compartment. It became very popular very quickly, and now hundreds of people have made what is known lovingly as the modified Aries. So that modified Aries then paved the way for the rest of these add-ons to come. The more you guys saw me make, the more you asked for it, and I decided, you know what, let's just do it all. So we did. We brought it full circle. We went from Aries all the way to Pisces. So let's get into them. So it seems to be everyone's favorite is the Saddlebag Minimalist. This is a full-length flap, and it's got a really nice curve and really just looks great with the curves that are already on the Aries. A couple of the other add-ons that I put in this bag are the bound top. Now I pulled this right from the Gaia crossbody, which was my first pattern, and a feature that I really love about the Gaia is this bound top. And then you also have this welted zipper here. Now this is the bonus add-on that's in the pattern, and it is simply a welted zipper pocket. So it kind of has a lot of the methods that we use in our normal zipper overlay construction, but now we've added this welted top to it, and it's a little bit different construction, but my testers seem to love it. Not really a minimalist, totally fine. So I made this bag and this video tutorials to show you kind of how you can pair so many of these add-ons together into one single bag. So on this bag, I included the exterior slip pocket that runs almost the full height of the main panel. So you have a really nice deep slip pocket. The exterior zipper pocket here, that's just that traditional zipper overlay that we all know and love. So we also have this alternate D-ring connector here that enables you to completely skip edge painting from the original Aries. This D-ring connector will work with the original Aries or either of the 2 minimalist construction methods in the add-on pack. Then we have that recessed zipper there, and inside we have card slots that can be used kind of in any bag that you'd like to put them in. And your interior slip pocket here that also can be used to berth a bag. But wait, there's more! Not only will you get instructions for how to do this wristlet pouch with these grommets and circle gate ring installations, but you'll also get a guide to quilting your bag panels. You'll get a full detail of how I do it when I quilt my bag, and I'll include instructions for how to get this design on your Aries, which is well suited for your Aries because it's almost completely avoided in any of your trimming. Included with your Pisces Pack purchase, you will get your instructions file, new pattern pieces, SVG files for the 3 major cutting machines, AO files, and projector files, all for the new pieces. I've also updated the Aries crossbody PDF pattern to have the stabilizer pieces for the cutting files, which it didn't originally have. Included in your instructions and in your printable pieces file, you will find a flowchart. You'll have the smaller format in the instructions and a larger format in the printable pieces file. This flowchart is for you to kind of wrap your brain around the order of operations in which you need to tackle all the add-ons you want to throw into your bag. Keep in mind that my patterns are always device friendly and not printer friendly. This PDF pattern has 98 pages and it has over 350 pictures included within those 98 pages. So if you want to print, be my guest, but you can utilize all the hyperlinks and all of the full color, crisp pictures by using a device instead. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at knottedthreadsco@gmail.com. I don't really keep up with the comments here, but I will try my best. So without further ado, let's just get into it. Jumping into our Saddlebag Minimalist, we will need 2 flat pieces. You will have your exterior and your lining. If you have a directional print like me, what you want to make sure that you do is keep your flat edge at the top for your exterior and the flat edge at the bottom for the interior, for the lining. You will need your upper main lining, your lower main lining, for this whole tutorial, whenever I reference a lower main lining, it will always be at the full height. If I ever needed you to cut on the dash line, I would make sure that I specify that. So whenever you're looking through the add-on pack and you see lower main lining, it's always at the full height of the original pattern piece. The original pattern piece had one height and then a dashed line that you would fold down. It's about a ½ inch shorter, and you would cut it there. But you don't do that for any of these pieces in this tutorial. And then you'll have your main panel. As you can see, I've zigzagged around the edges. You do not need to do that for most of your materials, but for this material that's loosely woven, you absolutely need to. You will need to take extra precautions when using material like this, and that just comes with time, and I'm not really going to get into that here in the tutorial, but I will kind of point out the things that I've done, but not give you full explanations, if that makes sense, just so you understand why I've done it here, but I didn't do it in the pattern. So I have done the prep and added the stabilizers on the pieces that that I instruct you to in the beginning of this section. So I have decided to do 2 flap stabilizers. I tell you in the instructions that you can either do 1 or 2. I prefer the feel of 2 layers of Decoville lights, especially if I'm using fabric like I am now. But it's up to you. If you decide not to do a layer of Decoville light on your lining, I do give you instructions for placing a square of Decoville light on your lining piece where your magnets will go, so you make sure that you have that stability and safety net of this extra stabilizer on your materials. Of course, with all your stabilizers, you're going to mark in the measurement that I give you in the pattern and fuse your materials on top of those. Again, this is woven, so I did first do a layer of woven interfacing and then I added my flap. This is not technically Decoville light, it's actually Profuse Stiff. This is from Wawak, and it's really great stuff. That's essentially all I use nowadays. It's a lot cheaper, it's easier to get, and I really enjoy how it behaves and fuses. And so for my exterior materials outside of my flaps, I am using a layer of woven interfacing on top of my vinyl, and then on top of that I have fused Thermolam. And so I've done that on these. As you can see, I've also done some prep work on here. My lighter took those lines off. I'll have to redo those. And I've done some very, from this side, ugly edge painting, but it will all turn out well in the end. So again, fuse my stabilizers. Those are what I'm using for this bag. I do like the feel of the woven plus the Thermolam. I really like that combination of stabilizers for this bag. I also really love foam, but because I'm doing this welted zipper pocket, I did it in the pattern because I wanted to have foam and I wanted to show you using foam, but truly it's not the best option if you're doing this welted zipper pocket, so I decided to forego that. So the first few steps in the Saddlebag Minimalist, I walk you through installing your magnets here. You're going to make sure that you put them on the lining of your flap. You don't want to put it on the exterior. Of course, your magnets won't work there. And then what you do is you first you put your magnet through, then you install your magnet stabilizer. This is just a piece of fleece here that I have added between the material and the washer. And then I've flattened my prongs. And so now on top of those prongs, what I like to do is to fuse another piece of Decoville light or a piece of duct tape on top. And what that's going to do is that's going to make sure that these prongs aren't going to wear down on my exterior over time. We do have that layer of Decoville light on the exterior, but I just find it important to further give one more thing that can protect it, because as much as we love our stabilizers and we love our bags, the last thing we want is to be wearing it and loving it for a year and then all of a sudden this little prong pokes through, and it doesn't hurt to have an extra layer. And so I like to just kind of offset the corners by doing it that way, and then I'll fuse it right on top. Now, before we sew the exterior and the lining together, if you wanted to place a handmade label or a logo label or a magnet or something along those lines on the exterior flap, definitely do that now. I like to place it about 7 inches down from this top edge, but use your best judgment. It is a pretty deep flap that goes down most of the main panel, so you have a good bit of wiggle room here, and there is a little window that I've provided on the pattern piece that shows you kind of the ideal placement of your images. So keep that in mind, get your label on there if you want. If not, then we're going to move right on. So we're going to place these right sides together, and we're going to clip around these curved edges. So once you have everything nice and clipped and everything is super aligned, we're going to start from one corner, it doesn't matter which one, and we're going to sew around this curved edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you're back stitching well when you're starting and ending, because we're going to be turning this right side out, and so we want to make sure that we have a nice secure seam opening, or seam, I guess, edge there, so that we don't open it up anymore and we keep it really nice and secure. So I'll do that now, and then we'll work on trimming and then turning. The next part of the flap construction is to trim down these seams and to cut some darts in these bottom edges. But I wanted to just focus on something real quick. So because I had zigzagged my seam, whenever you do that, it tends to shrink it in just ever so slightly. And so as you can see, my seam line is very close to my interfacing, and that is okay as long as I'm not on, or my stabilizer. As long as I'm not sewing on top of my stabilizer, I'm okay. Next to it is fine. Ideally, you want that gap, but it's not the end of the world, so we're not going to let it be. But you definitely want to make sure that if you have sewn over your stabilizer in your bottom corners, you need to address that now. That's going to affect how this whole curve looks on the outside, because then you're going to be folding over that stabilizer versus keeping it inside the seam, and you're only folding over the seam allowance, right? So that will make a difference in how those curves behave, so just double check that on both sides before moving on. For trimming your seam allowance, I do have you trim down these straight edges and then snip some darts into these corners. It's very important that you snip these darts. So when you're looking at your seam here, it is a smaller shape than this outer shape. So then when you take this even bigger shape and try to put it inside of this smaller one, now you need an even smaller shape than what this seam line is. And so you need to remove the excess material. Now, this has been asked a billion times to me if using pinking shears will work. And a lot of things, sure. Not everything. What the task that I'm asking you to do is to remove excess material. Yes, pinking shears can do that, but really it's the deeper darts that remove the material and allow it to fully collapse in on itself when it goes inside of your bag. And so if you only use pinking shears, you're not getting as deep of a zigzag as what you want, and that zigzag won't conform as perfectly to this curve as maybe your darts can. Not to mention, you have different curves on different parts of bags, and the sharpness of that curve is going to determine whether or not pinking shears will work. If this is a nice gradual one, probably, but not always. So just use your best judgment, but in my opinion, I'm always going to cut darts before I'm going to use my pinking shears. So this material that I'm using, again, it is a loosely woven material, so I need to be very careful about how I treat it when I trim it. So I don't necessarily want to trim these down, because then I'm compromising the integrity of my material. So I don't want to cut that zigzag off up here, because if something happens and it starts to fray, then it's going to go through that seam, and I don't want that. So I'm not going to trim these top edges like I tell you in the pattern, but you should do that. There's no reason why you shouldn't, unless you're using a material like that is loosely woven that is not recommended for. For these darts, it's super important. So I'm going to cut them. And so for this next step, I'm gonna fast forward me doing these, cutting these darts, because they do take a bit of time, and then I'm going to immediately apply some fray check. Now, this is going to help my material. It's gonna absorb into the material and be like a light layer of glue that's gonna stop it from kind of shifting and rubbing and then fraying out. And so it's really important. As you can see, I use a lot of it, especially when I'm using OSHA materials. And so, like I said, I'm going to zoom through this. I'm going to cut my darts. I'm going to immediately apply fray check, and then I'm going to turn my flap right side out. And then that's when I'm going to check back in. So now that I've turned this right side out, if you're using a Decovil Light or a Profuse Stiff like me, and you also applied it to woven interfacing like me, a lot of stabilizers don't tend to fuse really well to woven interfacing. And so I was kind of really pushing and trying to be quick with my turn, and I had kind of undid I kind of pulled it up from the material. So what I'm doing now is I'm using a kind of curve pusher thingy doodle, and I am just making sure that my stabilizer is going where it needs to go on each side, the lining and the exterior, and then I'm making sure that the seam allowance is wedged between those pieces of Decovil Light. And that makes sure that the curve and everything is where I want it to be. So once you have turned your flap right side out, peek inside and make sure all of your stabilizer is staying nice and put. Nothing is overlapping your seam allowance inside of your seam or anything like that. And then give it a nice press to remove all of those yucky wrinkles that we got in the Decovil Light or Profuse Stiff. And then we'll move on to top stitching. So that flap is nice and pressed. I've got really nice smooth edges there, and my curves are wonderfully rounded. So a good way to make sure that you are getting that nice rounded curve there is to, before you top stitch, peek inside your bag or your flap and look down at your darts. And if you see any darts kind of crossing over one another, then you know that you need to kind of push that curve out and snip those darts wider versus more narrow, and then put it back in. And once those darts kind of nest right next to each other the whole way versus overlap the whole way, you know you're going to get a nice round curve. And so that does take some time to know kind of how wide to cut your darts and the shape of the darts, but with time you'll figure it out. But just know that woven is a lot more forgiving in that aspect. So now what you will do is top stitch around your flap using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I like to start in the top center so that I hide my back stitching. So now that your flap has been top stitched around the entire edge, I want you to find the center of this flat edge of your flap, as well as the centers of the flat edges of the lower main lining and the upper main lining. While you're there, if you haven't already, also mark the top and bottom centers, just because you'll probably need them later on. So now we will flip our flap over. You want the magnets to be facing up like this, and you want to take your flap and place it right side down on top of the right side of your lower main lining. Center them using your center markings and clip along this edge. So before I move on, I like to double check my center placement here between the edge of my flap and the edge of my lower main lining, just to make sure that I accurately found the center of both. All right, after a very minor adjustment, I made sure everything was nice and centered. And so now what I'm going to do is just baste this on using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So you can see that I have basted that edge up there. So now what I'm going to do is take my upper main lining and I'm going to flip it and put it right side down, aligning the flat edge with the flat edge of the other two pieces. Align that center marking and clip. So now that you have your edge clipped, you're going to take this to your machine and you're going to sew using a 3/8 inch seam allowance from edge to edge here. Make sure you backstitch well, because we're going to be snipping into the seam allowance. And also make sure that your angles at the 3/8 inch marking are lining up correctly. Again, center center markings are supposed to be perfect, but not always. So sometimes you may need to do a little bit of adjusting to make sure that these kind of overhangs here are at the correct depth, and that really helps you center your pieces even more. So we'll sew that seam, and then we'll do our snipping and then top stitching. So I've sewn that edge. I've done a teeny bit of back stitching right at that change in bulk where I step up to the flap, and I just like to do that here because, you know, not every machine is going to handle a change in bulk beautifully, and this back stitching kind of inline really helps make sure that you've got a nice secure seam with no issues, especially if there was a slight change in tension there. So now what we are going to do is we're going to flip this flap up, and what will happen when you do that is that the seam allowance wants to point down, and that's what we want. But when we allow all the seam allowance to point down, you do end up getting a bulky seam here. And so, of course, like always, I want to even this out as much as I can. And so I'm going to do some typical snipping that I like to do in my patterns, which is to kind of put your scissors in line with your stabilizer and trim vertically into your seam allowance for the upper main lining seam allowance only. Just like that. And then I'm going to flip this up. I'm going to butterfly that open and clip it like that. And so now when we go to sew it, we'll have a nice even edge there versus a bulky change. And that's typical of all my patterns. I really like to incorporate that stuff because to me, the bulk reduction steps are not only for your machines to be a little happier, but it ends up making a better bag in the long run. And it doesn't compromise the integrity of your seam there. So now what we're going to do is, if you can press this, give it a nice press. I am going to press it. It's not going to do much with this material, but it does help some. Sometimes it even just helps compress the stabilizer down, gives a little bit of indentation of that seam, and it just kind of really helps smooth everything out a little bit more. Once I get done pressing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch starting on this straight edge here. And then I'm going to go down here and then back up here. And so I'm going to keep my back stitching about 1/8 to a 1/4 inch in here, parallel to this edge, and then follow this using a 1/8 inch seam allowance, and then stop about 1/8 of an inch to a 1/4 inch from the edge, and again do some parallel back stitching there. And what that's going to do is it's going to tack down that bulk reduction we did, and then it'll also hide our back stitching. So I will do that, and then I'll show you. So you can see I've top stitched in that U shape there, and that gives us the, it hides that back stitching as well as tacks down that bulk reduction there. So your back panel now, your back main panel is essentially what we've created with these two individual pieces, and the flap is now done, so we can set this aside. If you wanted to add a slip pocket, I don't cover that, obviously. I'm keeping this a very simple bag. I also don't cover it in the pattern, and I had someone who asked me about it, and I hadn't done it before because I had always put, when I've done the flap with the slip pocket, I've done it with it on the slip pocket on the front, but there are quite a few testers who put the slip pocket on the back of the bag. And so you will have to kind of work through that on your own. Just know that you should be, you're going to do essentially the same thing with this, but instead of this being your exterior material, it will be your lining material. And then you'll kind of do both the flap and the slip pocket just about simultaneously, although you could get the flap done first if you really wanted to, and then you do the steps of the slip pocket, and then when it comes time to attach it to this main panel, then you would do all those steps there. But again, in the pattern and in this video, I do not cover that. I also haven't done it myself, so I'm hesitant to fully instruct you on how to do it because I really like having personal experience before I kind of dish out information. But you can always ask in the Facebook group or email me directly, and I'll give you as much help as I can. So the last bit of the Saddlebag Minimalist section is going to be installing these magnets on your main panel. It's going to be the same exact process in which you installed them on the flap, but it'll just be on your material here. And so I still am going to go ahead and attach my two little pieces of Decoville Light over them so that I'm going to protect my lining, and then we'll be done with this, and I'm going to move right on to getting this welted zipper pocket sewn in. So we're going to move right on to zipper pocket B, the welted version. And so what you'll need for that is your main panel, your exterior zipper pocket lining, your zipper cover, your number 5 nylon zipper tape, and your number 5 nylon zipper pull. So in the first couple of instructions in the welted zipper pocket give you instructions about where to draw this rectangle. And I instruct you to first do it on your paper pattern piece of your main panel, just so that you have a good template to use going forward. But even if you use that template, make sure that once you draw your window on, before you cut it out, make sure that you are using a ruler to double check that this window here is parallel with this bottom edge and as straight as you can make it. And that way, you don't have a crooked pocket. So I also instruct that if you want to edge paint this raw edge here, please do so. I did kind of a not greatest version of edge painting for sake of time. It's also going to my friend, so she can just deal with it. But because I also used woven interfacing, that does kind of make it a lot harder to top stitch, because you have kind of that woven gridded texture on the edge of your pocket. And so I went through and I kind of used my lighter to melt away my thermolam, which kind of pulled that back away from the window, which is really easy to do. And then I trimmed away as much of that woven as I could, and then I kind of very softly went in with that edge paint and allowed it to seep down until that edge of the thermolam, so that I could make sure that it wouldn't be seen that much, but it still won't be seen all that much. The only edges you're really going to see are these top 3 edges of the window, and then that's it. This one's pretty much going to be hidden. If you were using Decoville Light, you don't need to do a ton of trimming here, because it's really easy to edge paint that material even when it's in line with your exterior material. If you were using fusible foam like I do in the pattern, you would really need to trim this back before you do any edge painting. And because if I was using fusible foam, more than likely I wouldn't be using woven interfacing, so I wouldn't have had to worry about that kind of strange textured edge. So just make sure you get that done before moving on, because you really want kind of a, not necessarily smooth, but a compressed edge in which to do all this top stitching on. So once you've trimmed, melted, or edge painted, or all 3 of the of your stabilizer away from that window, I give you some measurements to draw this rectangle around this window. Now this is going to help you align your zipper tape so that the coils are like almost perfectly centered in this window here. Now there's no such thing as perfect, so it can be off in the process of sewing and turning and doing things, but this really gets you started off on the right foot. And so you can apply this method also to the zipper overlay. It can be a little bit more difficult because you have way more materials involved there, and so it might be harder to draw that consistent line, but it's definitely worth trying. So I would say give it a go if you're struggling always aligning those coils in the middle of your window. Then you will take your zipper cover here, and you're going to draw a center line along the length of that. And then you're going to apply some glue on one side. Doesn't have to be really neat, it just needs to be glued. And I like to do this because I like to create as nice and flat of a cover as possible. Now you will get that with top stitching and all that stuff, but I just like how kind of solid it makes it. And so I'm just kind of applying a bunch. My glue is not coming out very nicely. And then I'm going to use this little applicator thing that I have, and I'm going to smooth it out just so that I don't have any major clumps or hard bits on my zipper cover. And then I'm going to fold it in half like this, give it a good seam roll, and then set it under something like some rulers weighed down so that I get a nice flat zipper cover that I don't have to worry about. I'll do something like this so that the it's getting smushed, and while the glue is drying, it is nice and flat, and I don't have to worry about it curling up or anything. It kind of really smushes it, makes it nice and even while the glue dries. So I'm going to allow that zipper cover to dry, and while we're doing that, I am going to take my nylon zipper tape and align it with the widest edge of my exterior zipper pocket lining. Keep in mind this is not a perfect square, so one side is shorter than the other, and so make sure that you're applying your zipper tape to the longer side. And then we will base this edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I know it's a little hard to see with that black zipper there, but keep in mind that your coils should be facing up, as well as your lining should be facing right side up, okay? So then we're going to take this and just flip it to the other side. Again, you can see your coils here, and those should be right side up in this process, and your material should be right side up that you're attaching it to. So when you're explaining that in the pattern, it is a little difficult because I'm saying, well, put your zipper right side up on top of your exterior zipper pocket lining right side up, blah blah blah, flip them not to be right sides together. There's a lot of information there, so I try to just do it through showing more so than explaining, but just hopefully you have done that correctly. So I'm going to base along this edge as well. So we've got that base set on, and then I like to give this a press so that all my seam allowance, or like this one is flat, there's no folding there, and this one is pointing down. And then what I'll do is when I go to align it under my material, and I'm working on this straight edge first, I have nothing but a straight edge, no folds or anything in which to work with, and it's nice and flat and easy for me to align my zipper window over it. So then we're going to apply some double-sided tape. I'm going to do one row of double-sided tape right above this bottom drawn line like this. And then I'm using 1/8 inch double-sided tape for that. And so then up top here, I'm going to apply a 1/4 inch double-sided tape. And there's reasoning for that. It's just because we need a lot more grip here with that extra zipper window. And it's a little hard to get that with the 1/8 inch double-sided tape. So I'm going to put my 1/4 inch away now, but I'm going to keep my 1/8 inch handy because we'll need that in a moment. So then I'm going to remove the bottommost double-sided tape, so this bottom one right here. And I'm going to leave my zipper tape folded up like this, the exterior zipper pocket lining folded up like this. And I'm going to align that bottom edge with that drawn line just like this. And I'm going to give it a nice little press like this to make sure it's nicely aligned, and then we're going to flip it over. And if you see, right now we're only focusing on this bottom edge. We're not going to focus up here because we've got that fold and it's not attached, so we're not going to get an accurate depiction of how everything is aligned. But if your line was crooked, then you'll see that in this moment, and so mine is, so I'm going to adjust it slightly. So we've got these coils nicely aligned using that drawn line down there. And then now we're going to start the process of sewing around this box, okay? And so we're going to start and stop this first seam, which is just this bottom edge right here. We're going to start it about 1/8 of an inch before the window and end it about 1/8 of an inch before the window. Now you can use a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch if you want. I typically use about like halfway between a 1/16 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch, kind of right in the middle there is kind of like my sweet spot. But as long as you're staying within 1/8 of an inch, you're good to go. And so you're going to start with long tails, top stitch along this bottom here, and end with long tails. And then we will pull those threads to the back, knot them together, and then we'll move on to applying the zipper window. So as you can see, I started before and after my window about 1/8 of an inch. There is no back stitching, and I did pull my thread to the wrong side, and I knotted it and then melted it because I'm using bonded thread. If I was using something like cotton thread or just a regular polyester thread, I wouldn't be doing this. I would instead knot it and then put it like a dab of glue or fray check or something, and then I would trim it down from there. But this is what I can do because I am using bonded thread, so that's good to go. I did have to swap out my thread on my flatbed because I've got a little bit more narrow foot for how close that we're getting to these coils here. I actually had to redo it because when I initially did it on my cylinder arm, I have the standard foot on there and it's just so wide that it was kind of pushing this zipper up, and I wasn't liking that too much. So I swapped it out and here we are. So now what we're going to do is, because I'm doing this kind of in real time in the video, real time I should say, I needed to let my zipper cover dry some. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch, or I'm going to baste this edge here, this raw edge closed. Now I say it's optional for you to top stitch this folded edge right here. You can do that whether, you know, that's up to you. I'm actually going to leave this one non-top stitched just because I do prefer the look, but I wanted to show you in the pattern what I meant by top stitching both this raw edge here, or basting this raw edge, and then top stitching this one. So I'm going to do that now. So I've got that basted, and that's just going to make it easier to work with. We don't have to worry about anything coming up. And now that the glue is dried, you see we have no gaping here in this zipper cover. It's just really nice and flat, and it's just a single piece, and that's what we want. So now we're going to take our main panel and we're going to flip it over so you're looking at the back side. And then we are going to flip our lining down like this. And we are going to take the double-sided tape backing off of this double-sided tape. Now you're going to take this zipper window and you're going to align it right with that top edge there. You're going to use your marking as a guide, and you're just going to nestle it right up in there. So now you will apply some double-sided tape right on the top edge of that zipper window like this. So now what you want to do is place some double-sided tape right on top of that window cover or zipper cover, and you want to remove that double-sided tape backing and then fold up this zipper pocket lining to match that edge of the zipper cover. And then now you can give this a good press so this is all nice and flat, and make sure that everything is nicely aligned from the front. You see we have not put on our zipper pull yet. We will be doing that in a moment, but we're not going to put it on all the way, and you'll see why. So I'm going to give this a press. So now that I've given it a press, you can see that everything's nice and flat, and it's exactly what we want to work with. And this gives us a nice kind of setup to double check this zipper window one more time before moving on. Make sure this is as straight as you can make it, and make sure you're happy with it and it's centered on the wrong side of your material. So the next thing we're going to do is put on our zipper pull. This is the one that I'm using. Love that. I got this from Thumbs and Thimbles, and I actually helped kind of design it a couple years ago. I really love it. And so instead of zipping it onto your material all the way, we're only going to put it on this little area on the wrong side of your material. So we're not even going to zip it into the zipper window just yet at all. And so I'll do that now. I know that this is one of those things that a lot of people struggle with. And I was actually teaching a class, or really teaching an open sew in November of 2024. And somebody had asked me, like, what's the trick? Like, do you have a method? And I just have done it so many times, I don't really feel like I have a method. But we'll see if I can show you how I do it. So I've put this on at I make sure I start with a straight edge. I'll put this on at an angle. And then I know that those teeth are hovering kind of at an angle on the right side. And so I'm going to shove in my left side here also at an angle. And then it kind of puts it on crooked. It's hard to see because it's black on black. I do apologize. But when you do that, then you kind of pull this back slightly, and you'll kind of hear or feel it click. And then once you get there, as long as you start out with a straight edge and you end with a straight edge, let me see, right there, then you know it's on straight. And if that gap right there is nice and even, it's not overly lumpy on one side and straight on the other, you're good to go. And so I know it's weird to have the zipper pull kind of sitting there and now you have this whole piece all sitting up and stuff like that. But the reason why I do that with this particular zipper method is because I find it really important that we have a nice flat zipper cover here to work with now. And then once we get to where we've secured half of it, then we can push this through and we can finish sewing a nice flat half over here. But if I were to zip this pull on an inch or two or even halfway into my coils here, then I'm going to be lifting that up, and that can affect the way that we sew this, and we just don't need to deal with that. So if we keep it right there on that edge, we got about 3/4 of an inch over there to work with, so we have enough to put on the zipper pull, and then we can go and finish sewing the window. So when I go to my machine, I'm going to put my needle in this first hole right here. I'm going to sew up to about 1/8 of an inch past this window, and then I'm going to continue to sew until I hit about halfway. I'm going to leave my needle in the down position, and then I'm going to kind of pivot my work, push my zipper pull on properly, push it all the way to the other side, and then finish sewing just like I did on the other side, down this edge past about 1/8 of an inch, and then meet that needle hole right there. Make sure that you're being mindful of the bulk as you go, because there are some bulky areas that you're going to be going over. Make sure that you start and end with long thread tails so that we can pull them all to the back side or the wrong side when we're done for a nice clean finish. And be mindful that if you do end up unraveling or unsticking any of this on the back of your material as you are pushing on your zipper pull, that you take that moment and re-adhere that double-sided tape as you need to. So I'll do that and then I'll show you what it looks like. So you can see we now have the appearance of a continuous stitch here. Zipper pull is happily on and zipped all the way out of the way. We have our welted pocket there. So you do have obviously that lift where the zipper pull is. That's kind of inevitable there. If you did this on foam, it may sink in just a little bit more, but it's always kind of be a little bit raised, but that's okay. If we were to open this zipper pocket, we would see that we still have access. We have no shown edges or stitches in there. Everything is nicely concealed. That's why I like doing it that way. So now all we have to do is close up these sides here. So we are going to put our needle down in right below the coils, and then we'll sew down this edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and making sure we backstitch well the beginning and end of both seams on both sides. So I've got both of those sides sewn up, and now we have no open edges. So I'm just going to show you, kind of give you an idea of the size of this pocket. I have a Google Pixel 9 Pro, if you want to look up those dimensions. I'm going to shove this right in there. Fits nicely. And there we go. So while it's in use, it still sits nicely. It's not overly bulky or anything. Yeah, I do really like it. So I hope you like it too. So for the bound top, you'll need to have all of your add-ons completely finished except for potentially the recessed zipper where you'll need to put on your zipper once your bag is assembled, and the final touches of your alternate D-ring connector. Now for this bag, I'm keeping it really simple. I have no interior pockets. I have one exterior pocket. I'll have the main compartment that has the flap closure, and I will have a strap anchor as my D-ring connector instead of either the alternate D-ring connector or the original ones. You'll also need your top binding. I give you those measurements in the pattern, and if you did want to edge paint that, then you need to make sure that that is fully done and dried before we start this section. So when we normally stabilize a bag, we have all of our stabilizer pieces be shrunk so that they are inside of our seam allowances. That's the same for a turned bag or for a drop-in bag. But for a bound top, you don't want that because you want to make sure that you're sewing on a stabilized portion of your bag. Well, instead of giving you all new pieces so that you could potentially mix them up and waste materials, I decided the easiest path forward for everyone would be to trim down the top edges of your pieces right before you assemble them, so that you make sure that you stay on the stabilized edge when you're sewing, and we still have the same shape and size of the bag that we wanted, but now we just have a bound top instead. So to create that edge, we're going to measure down 3/8 of an inch from each corner and make a horizontal mark there. And then we're going to take our pattern piece and we are going to align it right under those edges there, just like that. Try to get out of that light. Hard to see, but they're right under those edges. And then I'm just going to make sure it's nice and centered between the two. And I am going to trace this top edge. Now I'm using my upper main lining piece because it's the same curve as the main panel, but you could use the main panel piece if you really wanted to. It's not a big deal. So I've done that for all of these pieces. Luckily on the gusset pieces, you just need to draw that line. You don't have to truly trace the pattern piece there. And so then you need to trim all these tops down at this new traced edge that you just made. Alright, so I've changed one of my lights a little bit. I'm hoping that it maybe improves this kind of light imbalance that's going on here. I know the dark colors and everything, it's kind of under and overexposing in some areas, and I'm having a really hard time getting it to be consistent because it's so dark outside. Winter is so dark and stormy, and here we are. There's barely any sunlight today. So hopefully it's not too bad. Sorry if you notice that light change and it bothers you. I'm trying my best. Without further ado, we have trimmed these top edges, so now we have a more stabilized top throughout, and that's what we want. So now we're going to jump right into the minimalist construction. And so I'm going to set aside my lining pieces here because I'm going to work first on my exterior, then on my lining. So we're not starting at the very beginning of the minimalist construction because of course we're doing the bound top. So I give you a step number to reference in the pattern, which would be step number 4. That's what we're going to start with. And so for this one, I'm going to just have my gusset and my front main panel because of course this is my flap, so it's my back main panel. So I have my handy dandy stapler here, and we're going to take our gusset and we're going to flip it right sides down on top of our front main panel and align our center marking right down there. And then we can either clip or staple them together. And then I like to continue stapling along this straight edge. And then I'm going to bring this up and match this top corner right up here of the gusset with the top corner of the main panel, and we're going to clip or staple. Going to do the same on this side. Match up that corner with that, well, just match up both corners and clip or staple. I'm not pulling or stretching anything. I'm just aligning them as I go. And I'm going to stop as soon as it starts to pull away from that curve, and I feel like I have to pull on the gusset to fit that curve. Then that's when you want to stop stapling. And so then what you will do is you're going to snip into your gusset only. There's no need to snip into your main panel because you're not trying to stretch your main panel, you're trying to stretch your gusset. And so we're going to snip about 1/4 inch apart and about 1/4 inch deep. You might not need to do all of these snippings. If you have a very stretchy material, you might notice that you don't need a ton of snips. It might stretch really nicely. But the goal is to allow the material to expand so that you can just press it down and it nicely fits into that curve just like that. That's exactly what we want. So we're going to then staple this in place. Now while you're stapling, make sure that you're stapling into the individual little snips here, because if you staple and only snip in the gaps, then it's not going to hold anything. All right, so this is what we're going for right here. That nice gently eased curve, just like it is in the original Aries. And all my staples are kind of holding each little section down, so I don't have to worry about them popping out. So now we've got all our staples on all our edges. We're going to start from one edge, one corner, and sew all the way around this exterior until we hit to the other edge. We're going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to make sure that we backstitch really well at the beginning and the end. As you go around these curves, I suggest using a smaller seam allowance so that you can make sure that you are, not smaller seam allowance, I'm sorry, a smaller, shorter stitch length so that you're really following that curve a little bit more consistently versus longer stitch lengths will hop over curves, and so you have a bit more of a rugged shape versus a nice smooth round curve. And yeah, we'll check back in once I get that done. So I've got this seam all sewn up. If this was the back panel, then I would have a horizontal seam here from where I attach the upper main lining and the lower main lining. But because this front panel doesn't have that, I don't have to worry about that. But when I repeat this process for the back panel, what I'll need to do is right after I've sewn this seam, I'll need to go in and do some reinforcement stitches right next to that, like perpendicular to that seam, so that I can really make sure that I lock in all my stitches and I don't have to worry about them coming out. So I've sewn that seam, and now I'm going to take out all of my staples. So now that I've removed my staples, I'm going to make some horizontal snips. Now if you were doing a normal minimalist drop-in, you would make this at 3/4 of an inch down, but for this one we're doing it at about 3/8 inch down. And then we're going to trim down these straight edges here down to about 1/4 of an inch. So as you can see, I stopped my trimming where the snips were made to ease into the curves. And if you've also noticed, I've done that second row of stitching around these curves, and I have just found that that kind of helps a little bit give you a smoother curve. We still have some more trimming to do, but I'll just show you that alone does not make for a great curve, but it does help contribute to it. You do that before or after you do your dart snippings. Sometimes I like to do it before, sometimes I'll do it after. It's just whatever I'm feeling. So I just finished my snips, and I wanted to show you the difference that proper snips make. Even when you do that second row of stitching, if you don't do any snips, you don't get a nice round curve. But I wanted to show you how that translates on the inside. So if you look inside here, none of those darts are overlapping. This is pointing inwards, but that's to be expected, right? But over here, you see all those buckles, and all those buckles correlate to not nice curves in here. This divot in is where this middle section right here is kind of buckling inwards. And so all of that seam allowance there is causing an effect on the outside curve. And so that's why I tell you that something like pinking shears aren't necessarily going to work perfectly for this sort of job, because you have to remove so much material. And so that's when snipping darts really comes into play. Doing these snips after you do that additional stitch around the curve can give you a good guide for how deep to cut your darts and give you a limit. And if you accidentally cut into your stitches, you're not cutting into your actual seam stitches. So that is what some good darts and trimming and that extra seam will do for you. There are no darts overlapping there, and that's how I know I've got a really nice seam. So I'm going to repeat this process on the back panel of my back main panel here. Again, I'm going to start by aligning those center markings and stapling there, and then along the straight edge, and then matching up the corners and down those straight edges. So again, I'm going to make those snips into my gusset so that I can expand it to my main panel. I will staple all those snips to the main panel and then sew around the stapled edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I have this back panel sewn on. I've done the same thing I did on the front there, and I have done some reinforcement stitches on right next to those seams there, where the upper lining meets the lower main lining. And so now I'm just going to flip this right side out. So if you have a tool that's kind of like this, where you can kind of take a curved edge and kind of rub it against the seam here just to make sure everything is exposed, nothing's buckling, all that stuff. Everything looks good in there. And in here. Just going to do this to both the front and the back. Just to really work out those curves. Roll this bottom edge between your fingers and the sides. Really just kind of encourage it to be as fully exposed as it can be. Nice curves there. Nice curves here. And we are good to go with this for now. So, before I do this, I'm really bad about keeping my heat erasable pens nearby. I just like to use them in case I mess up so that I can redo it instead of having confusing lines. But of course, at this moment, when I want to press my bag to make it as fit for a drop-in as possible, I need to remake my center markings so I don't lose them. So I'm going to grab a pen and redo those. And the reason why those center markings are pretty important while you're doing the bound top and or the minimalist is because it's really important to match up the center markings, because then the rest of this these curves on the lining will match up perfectly with your exterior curves, and that's going to be the recipe for success there, because if they're slightly askew, then these curves won't match up and then you'll have a really hard time catching both edges correctly while you're sewing it. So I'm going to give this a press, and then I'm going to repeat this whole process on the lining. So I just finished stapling this gusset lining to the main lining, and I just wanted to make note that if you are like me and you're not adding in a recessed zipper or the original interior zipper pocket or anything that's going to cause this vinyl to fold back on itself, then you can just fold the lining material back on itself and top stitch that along the seam, and then there's no need for any bulk reduction in your gusset lining pieces up here. Okay, it's not that bulky of a seam. It won't be any more bulky than essentially if you were doing the original method, and it's just in that one spot, so it's not a big deal. Do keep in mind though that just like in the original Aries, once you kind of hit this area, once you start out at 3/8 inch seam allowance, you need to grade up to a 5/8. Maintain your 5/8 until you hit about the other seam, and then grade back down to a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You're going to do that for both sides of the main lining here, and make sure that when it comes time to trim everything down, you also do those reinforcement stitches right next to this seam, just like you did on the exterior, because we want everything to stay nice and secure. For my pinking shears lovers, feel free to use pinking shears on your lining and trim it between about 1/4 of an inch. You can go a little bit closer if you'd like, but there isn't that much. The materials you're going to be using for your lining isn't going to be bulky, and so you shouldn't have an issue using pinking shears versus on the exterior when it's just a lot harder to get that nice smooth curve. Here on the lining, it's already not going to be the most perfect curve, and it's going to be on the inside of the bag, and the materials we're using is a lot more forgiving, so you're totally fine using pinking shears. So we are moving right along. We have assembled our exterior, given that a good press, assembled the lining, given that a good press as well. Got all of our seam allowances trimmed down as we called for, and now we're going to set these aside for a moment. So now we will grab our top binding strip, and you'll see on the wrong side, I've had you draw 2 lines along the length, which leaves you a center gap. And you want that because it's going to be very helpful in correctly and consistently applying your top binding. So now that we've got those lines drawn, we are going to set that aside, and we're going to grab again our lining and our exterior, and we're going to open this up, and we're going to insert our lining into our exterior. So you will want to make sure that you align your center markings here, like this. And you can either staple, or you can clip, or you could even run some double-sided tape on the inside. I'm just going to do a couple staples here. That way when I sew it all together, I don't have to worry about any shifting. I'm going to do the same here, line up those. Then I'm going to focus on these gusset seams. Now these can get, this sort of seam lineup is not my favorite, but it is typically manageable. It's actually less bulky doing this top binding method than it is folding it over on itself. So make sure you open them up because it's going to help distribute that bulk throughout, and then align them so that the seams are perfectly centered, and then staple or clip, and do the same with the other 3 gusset seams. Okay, so now we have our center point aligned, and then kind of our center aligned on 2 points over here. And so then I'm going to continue to staple these pieces together. Now, the easiest way to do it is to kind of focus on one quadrant at a time and like slightly pull it so that everything is taut against each other, and then I kind of grab it like this, and then you could place a clip or a staple. And then I follow along that top edge. So just wanted to zoom in and show you how everything is aligned here. That's what we want. You might have some gaps in here like this. That's totally fine. When we sew this on our machine, it's going to compress everything together in between those connection points of those staples. So don't stress about it too much. It will be compressed and even once we sew it. So now we're going to baste this edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now I've basted this entire edge here, and I've removed my staples. Now we can apply some double-sided tape to this top edge. So I remark upon this in the pattern, but depending on the machine that you have, should determine on how your bag is turned and oriented for this next step. So if your bag is, or if your machine does not have a cylinder arm or a free arm option, then you should turn this to be lining side out. It's basted, so it's not going to come apart. So you want to flip it lining side out. And you still want to follow all the instructions as I call for. We're still going to start on the lining side of your materials and flip the binding over to the exterior. But when you put it under your machine, you're going to top stitch, and then your exterior would now be inside of your bag, and so your presser foot would go down and touch your exterior as you sew. That way you can ensure that you're catching everything and your good stitch and your good alignment is on the outside, and any kind of excess binding or anything that's on the inside will again stay in the lining and it won't be visible on a day-to-day basis, only to you in your bag. So just make the best choice for the machine that you have. I have a cylinder arm, and so I'm going to use that for this process. And so I'm going to leave my exterior like it is right. I'm going to leave everything like it is now. And again, I'm going to start from the lining side. So the first thing that I'm going to do is apply 1/4 inch double-sided tape around the top edges of both the lining and the exterior. Now you can use an 1/8 inch in this process. I will say that a 1/4 inch is make sure that everything stays exactly put as you want it to be, but if you really don't, there's a chance that you will be sewing through this, and so if your machine doesn't like double-sided tape, please use 1/8 inch in this process. You just may have to clip a lot more than you would using 1/4 inch double-sided tape. So now that we have that double-sided tape applied on both sides, on one end of our top binding, on the right side, we are going to apply a strip of double-sided tape. Now you can apply 1/8 inch here. It's really only like a temporary hold that we need, and so it's just up to you. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the double-sided tape backing from the lining side of your bag. Again, this is going to be the same regardless of how your bag is oriented. You know, I just remembered that I'm not going to be covering up my seam with my connector like I normally do. This is great. I'm doing this in real time. Okay, so I'm actually going to not start in the center. Normally, you would start here in the pattern so that when you use one of the connectors that I provided for you, either in the original Aries or in the add-on pack, you would overlap it and then you would cover it by attaching the D-ring to it. But of course, I don't have a D-ring connector, and so I need to hide this seam. And the best way to do that is going to be for me to do that on this back seam right here. And that way it's always covered when the bag is in use, okay? Not ideal. Forgot about that part. I love that for me. Okay, so lining side. So you want to start with your top binding that has the double-sided tape edge on it, and you want to align this lower of those two lines with the edge of your bag, just like that. And you're going to continue to apply that around the top of your bag as you go. And as you go, continue to align the bottommost line with the top edge of your bag. Now I'm trying to show you and do this correctly, so I'm sorry if I get off camera here a bit or out of focus. But I'm not pulling or stretching my line. My hands are hot, so of course my line is starting to disappear. But you're going to keep going around this top edge. Now this is, I've given you measurements that are a little longer than what you need. You should be trimming some of this off. But depending on the thickness of your materials and how accurately you sewed and how much you want to overlap, all that is completely up to you. So that's what you want. I'm going to show you all this. So now what you'll do is you'll remove this double-sided tape backing right here. And you're going to just fold that over and snip the excess. Now you want it to overlap about 3/8 of an inch or a 1/2 inch or so. You want to give yourself a little bit of extra room, but you don't want to give yourself too much. So I'm actually going to give myself a little bit of extra, a little bit over a 1/2 inch here because I want it to be a little bit more neat than what I would care about if it was on the side of the gusset. So now I want you to remove the double-sided tape backing from the exterior side. So now I want you to remove this double-sided tape backing from the exterior side. Now I like to keep my clips handy for this just as an additional security for my placement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just fold over this binding as snugly over that top of the bag as I can. I really don't want to pull on it too hard, nor do I want to leave a gap up there. I just want it to be a nice snug fold, just like you always want binding to be. If you have a gap there, chances are you're not going to have consistent binding. Now we're going to keep doing this until we get close, till we get about right there. Now I'm going to do this on the back side as well. Now this is it's gonna have tension. It only has a tiny little piece of 1/8 inch double-sided tape on it, so don't overly stress if it comes undone. We will clip it down. So this is expected to happen. As this tension happens, it's gonna pull up on the double-sided tape before it's adhered. I'm going to actually apply that again. I don't want it to go too far off. So now we have what looks like this, and it's like, what are we going to do with that? So what we're going to do is first we're going to fold over this. Well, actually, first we're going to pull this up slightly. So you have a bit more bulk here because of this seam meeting up. So you just want to pull it up slightly because you're going to give a bigger gap here. That's what you're essentially doing. Is you have your normal gap, and now you're kind of giving it a little bit more space to accommodate that bulk. I'm going to pull it up slightly here. Not much, like maybe an extra 1/16 of an inch. And then fold it back down. And then pop it over. It's going to want to do that anyway. All the clips. Alright, so mine came undone again on this side, so really want to make sure that I get it as evenly applied as I can. There's probably going to be some adjustments that will need to be made, but I first want to get everything on there and look at it all folded over and see what I'm working with, and then I will make the adjustments. So now that I have applied that double set, or the clips and the binding throughout the top, I want to now use my clips as a guide and see how far down they go on both the exterior of my bag and on the interior. So if I'm finding a spot where my clips, sorry, it's a little hard to show you. If I'm finding an area where my clips aren't reaching, or my binding isn't reaching the depths of my clips correctly, then I know that maybe I didn't fold it over correctly. And so it's just good to keep checking, because you would rather check now and correct the problem now than do it when it involves ripping out stitches, right? That is one of the big benefits of this top binding, is that if you screw up your top stitch, your final top stitch, you can always redo it just by taking the binding off and redoing it. It does mean you would have to re-edge paint if you did that, but otherwise you're good to go. So I think this is pretty consistent. I'm pretty happy with it. Let me double check this gusset. I think this could stand, let me zoom back out. This could stand to be brought up and this brought down. So everything looks to be good to me, and I am happy with how I think it will turn out. And so now for that final top stitch, you're going to take it to the machine and you're going to use an 1/8 inch seam allowance from this bottom edge of your binding. Not from the top folded edge, but from this bottom edge painted edge. You're going to use an 1/8 inch seam allowance, so you'll be on this bottom third of the binding, and you're going to top stitch around the entire top of the bag. And so normally you would start here in the gusset, in the center of the gusset, because that's where your D-ring connector would be, and that's where you would be, that's where you could hide this overlap of your binding. But of course, I did not do that, so I won't be doing that, but you should be if you're using either of the connectors in the Aries or the Pisces pack, okay? So, but I'm going to start right here, and then I'm going to go around and then finish. So you can backstitch here because it's going to be hidden, but I would suggest not backstitching so much, or backstitching neatly if you're going to backstitch on this back panel. I probably will backstitch, I'll just make sure I do it as neatly as possible. Okay, so we have traversed the sewing room, and now we are at the cylinder arm, and you are lucky enough to be watching on my phone, so hopefully it isn't too bad. We'll see. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm putting my, I'm going to put my needle down so I can lift up my foot. And so I have my needle down right there where my top binding is overlapped. I know that between my needle and this edge of my foot is 1/8 of an inch, so I have a really easy guide to follow. If I can always use a presser foot as my guide of knowing where 1/8 of an inch is, I am a happy lady. So I'm going to go and I'm going to backstitch neatly here just to make sure that that's taken care of. And I'm going to keep going. Now, the reason why I'm not really checking on what's going on the inside is because I've already done that. I am just following my process as I have set myself up to do. I'm trusting in the process and I'm just going to commit. But as I cross the front, I'll be able to kind of see what it's looking like on the inside. A little close on the inside edge. A little closer than I would like to be. Ooh, I missed it. Oh no. It's okay. We can solve that problem. That's from that overlapping. That's exactly why I don't like to do that in the middle of a bag. I like to do that where it's hidden on the gusset connectors, and I can stop playing with it so much. So while this looks really great on the outside, on the inside, it didn't catch there. And that's because of that overlap. And it's why I really like doing it on the gusset sides, because I like to do it there because I can really make sure I catch everything, and I can kind of do it in a secure but ugly way. And so then I would cover it up with my D-ring connector. I probably said that like 10 times. But as you can tell, I'm not truly thrilled, and I don't have a seam ripper nearby. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove my stitches. I'll show you how I solve this problem. Okay, I'm going to pull out my stitches some until I'm ready to, until I can adjust this placement, and then I will just sew in the same needle holes that I used before. It's a little hard because I backstitched over it, and so it ends up being a little bit more problematic. Let me get my seam ripper. This is what happens when you try to make it easier on yourself by not doing fancy connectors like the D-ring connectors, and then you just decide to forge forward with a strap anchor, completely forgetting what you were supposed to be doing here. Okay, that's why I like to say I have enough time to do it right, not twice. But we can solve this. Really trying to avoid snipping into my stitches, but I might just have to because I've locked it in there by stitching over them. That's why backstitch is so important. Yeah, that's not coming out. So I'm just gonna have to do my backstitch. Call it a day. So this is where I have a good enough seam allowance that I can make work, and I have some wiggle room up top here. Now this is still the back of my bag, and so if I'm going to have some stray threads, I'm going to keep them back here versus on the inside of my bag. So I'm going to redo this. I'm going to focus on making sure that it is nice and level as I can make it. And I'll have holes to follow with. No matter if this comes up short on this edge, I can still follow these holes as long as it's good on the bottom side. Now, everything else on the inside of my bag looks really good. But this is from that overlap here, because your thickness of the material pulls up, which means you would need that excess, you would need a wider piece to cover and match up perfectly with this top binding. Do you want me to say it again, that that's why I like to do it on the gusset sides? Or the gusset, I guess it's always the gusset sides. All right, we're going to let this be ugly on the back so we have a nice pretty interior. And then we'll trim up that up, maybe, well, I don't know. We'll see how I feel. Oh no, like double-sided tape. Okay. Stop, readjust, take a breath, move forward. Okay. Now I should be hitting close to the previous stitches lines, but I might not be, but we'll see. Now I'm just checking every time I backstitch. Then I'm gonna go forward and lock it in again. All right. Oh, that is so much better. All right. It's my inside now, and I can live with that. All right. So I'm gonna pull this to the back side. So this is what I'm dealing with on the back. And what I'll do is probably trim that up a little bit, but I might just end up leaving it because, again, when the bag is in use, it's not really going to be seen. But I'm going to pull these threads to the back, knot them, and then I'm going to give everything a good press, and I will see you back at the cutting table. All right, I just wanted to show you before I pressed it. It still looks pretty good, but the flap definitely needs to be pressed, and so does the inside. But this is the inside of my binding, and it really does look good, except for that one part that I kind of had the mess up with when it came to the overlapping. But everything else was caught. It's inconsistent in some spots, but that's where I expect it to be because of that change in bulk. But other than that, it looks really good. Here it is from the outside. So now we'll just get it all snapped closed like that. And then we have ourselves a bag. So then you would just make your strap, give it a press, give it a really good press, and attach your strap, and you are good to go with the Saddlebag Minimalist with the bound top and the welted zipper pocket. All right, jumping right into the exterior zipper pocket, the traditional overlay method. So you'll need your main panel, your number 5 nylon zipper tape, your number 5 nylon zipper pull, your zipper overlay, and your exterior zipper pocket lining. Now, I have already fused my stabilizers here and any woven interfacing that I would be using, since I'm using woven and I'm not using waterproof canvas. And I have cut out my overlay. Now, if you would like to edge paint your overlay, definitely do that. I'm not going to edge paint these for now. For this bag, I did the edge painting on the other one, and so I'm just going to let this be. But I wanted to show you how I get these nice curves because I don't cut them. I actually punch them. So I'm going to grab my tools here. So this is the tool that I use. It's essentially a leather like edge punch, and so you just use this edge on your material on a corner and it gives you a rounded edge. I really like it. I've used it for a while now. I've recommended it to a lot of people and it really makes life a lot easier. And so I'm going to show you how I do that. Sorry, I had to overexpose this a bit so that you could see. What I like to do is take my tool and I kind of align it with these straight edges here and make sure I'm angling it so that it's hitting that corner, and essentially that's all that I'm going to take off. So I'm going to go ahead and get that punched now and show you what it looks like once I'm done. And so I was afraid to punch it too hard because I don't want to break my table cover here, but essentially you would punch it a lot harder and it would fully cut that edge for you, but it creates a really nice consistent corner that you can't really get when you hand cut. And so you can always use the SVG files if you have a machine, but if you don't have a machine and you don't want to pull it out constantly, then this little tool right here is super helpful. The brand is the same one right here, OWDEN, Odin. And essentially almost all my hole punches are this brand. I really like them. So the first couple steps of this section is going to tell you how to put this rectangle onto your main panel pattern piece so that you have a template that you can use. And so essentially you will just cut this rectangle out of your main panel piece, put this on top of your main panel pieces that you have cut out, and then you can just trace this inner rectangle. And what that's going to do is that's going to help you have a guide to then place your zipper overlay on top of your material. It's very handy. It's the method that I like to do. I find it to be the most consistent and the less amount of work overall. So once you have that rectangle drawn on there, we're going to set that aside. So you'll need to grab your exterior zipper pocket lining and your length of nylon zipper tape. And remember, this is not a perfect square, so the longer side is the one that will need to have the zipper tape clipped on. So we're going to clip this on like this. And then we're going to baste this seam up here using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Once this top edge is basted, we're going to fold up this bottom edge and meet the other remaining edge of the zipper tape. Sorry, I had a fuzzy, it was bugging me. And we will baste this edge just like we did the other. So now that we have that basted, I like to give this a good press right now so that, especially if I'm using directional material, it would be the edge that we just basted would be flat because that's going to go on the bottom of my zipper overlay, and this seam allowance here has been pressed up towards the top of that fold like this, and that just gives me a flatter edge in which to put my material on when it comes time to line everything up. That's my preference, but you can definitely do it as you will. So now you'll need your main panel and your zipper overlay. And on the back side of your zipper overlay, you're going to apply 2 rows of double-sided tape, one on top and on bottom. And once you get those applied, we're going to remove the outermost backings like this. And just like I said before, we're going to use that rectangle we drew to align our zipper overlay just like this. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch around this edge of the overlay using a 1/8 inch seam allowance, maybe a little bit less. I tend to like to use slightly less than that. And I'm going to start with long tails and end with long tails, and I'm going to make it look like one continuous stitch around the outside. I am not going to backstitch. I'm going to pull my thread tails to the back and knot them all together once I'm finished. So I'll show you all of that once that's done. So I have sewn around this exterior edge here. You can see my tension was kind of off in the corners. I pulled it out. I unpicked all my stitches and redid them, and I couldn't get a really good tension on my machine with this combination of materials. So I don't know. After 2 times, I decided to move on with life. And so here we are. I'm going to now grab, oh, I forgot to tell you, I had knotted and melted my threads here. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut into this zipper window here. I'm not going to cut into the overlay in this process at all. I'm only going to cut into this zipper window. Once you get your scissors in your overlay like this, you're going to cut, and then I like to just put my scissors under that overlay, give it a feel, make sure it's not catching it, and then fully snip. Do the same on the other side. So now I have snipped on this back side, and I want to continue to do that. So I'm going to keep very carefully, I'm going to snip further into this main panel right here. Then I am going to just keep snipping like this until I can see that other row of double-sided tape. And then what I'm going to do is essentially use that as my guide to continue to cut off this main panel from behind this zipper overlay. I want to be able to expose this tape so that I can use the tape. I've trimmed away that edge. It's not very pretty, but if you want to get an even cleaner edge, you can go around, and if you can pull your stabilizer away and further trim that away from this whole edge. I'm not too worried about it, so I'm going to let it be, but if you wanted to, again, just kind of pick that stabilizer back like this. Then you can use your scissors here to trim it away just like that. I'm not going to do that, but it's an option for you, especially if you're using something like foam. I have my main panel here, and I've trimmed that away, and now I have my exterior zipper pocket lining. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these two double-sided tape backings now. And I am going to take my fingers, and I really like to just grab these areas right here, and then I place this right over my zipper tape, and I use my fingers to feel where the coils are, because I know that I want them to be in those areas like this. And so if I feel the coils, I'm in the right ballpark, okay? So then I just use that to make sure that I kind of use my fingers back there to feel and make sure that everything is as centered as I want it to be, and I just start applying. I can readjust as needed, but I need a starting point, and so I just kind of start applying, and then I look at my zipper coils, and then I will alter as needed. If you wanted to try out the welted zipper pocket, there's some measurements I give you in that can help you when you're looking at it from this side make that alignment. But I sized the zipper overlay so that hopefully when you've trimmed it away, your zipper tape and your lining should fit in between that area you cut and the window. But I think I am going to call that good. And so what I'm going to do now is, so essentially we want to sew a rectangle around this zipper window, but we want to make sure that the lining is out of the way from the bottom when we do our first seam, and then we'll fold down our lining, and then we'll do the top seam. And so for now, we want to make sure that that lining is folded up like this, like it is right here. And we're going to start stitching about 1/8 of an inch before this window and end about 1/8 of an inch after this window. Just like we did with this outer edge right here, we're going to use that same seam allowance, whether it was just shy of 1/8 or it was a full 1/8, and then we're going to start and end with long tails so that we can pull it to the back side and knot it for a nice clean window when we're all done. Alright, so we have that seam sewn, and so now we can flip down that lining. And so I like to actually give this a really good press right now. Make sure this lining is pulled all the way down so that it doesn't ride up when I sew this next seam. I'm going to give this a really good press, and then we'll put our zipper pull on. So I have my zipper pull, and so I said this for the welted zipper pocket, so you're going to hear this a second time if you watch both parts. but I was teaching in November and somebody asked me if I had a tip about how I actually put on my zipper pulls, and I had to really think about it because I just kind of do it without thinking about it. So when I did, I realized that I put it on, I had start off with a straight edge, and then I put my zipper pull on one side at an angle. Now, I can already feel that this tape and this zipper pull are not happy together. It's a bit of a tight push here, so that's going to be fun. And then, so I started out at an angle, but I don't push it all the way through. It's kind of sitting about slightly in the pull, maybe about halfway, kind of where you would expect those two sides of coils to kind of meet. And then I kind of angle this one in there as well, the other side. And then it's not going to go in even at first because it's not inserted evenly. So what I do is they're both kind of halfway into the pull. So I just pull the zipper pull back slightly. Sometimes you can hear the click, but most of the time you feel it almost come out of that zipper pull, and then it kind of, when you start to push it back forward, it just aligns itself really easily. And once you have a new straight edge like that, you know your zipper pull has been inserted evenly. I've put my zipper pull on, and I can see that it's even because I can see that I have an even distance, the way that they come together right there. And my lining is now pressed down. Everything is nice and flat. Everything is as smooth as it could be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do just like I did on this one, except for I'm going to go around these top 3 edges. So I'm going to put my needle in this hole right here. I'm going to go up and all the way over, pivot, and end in that needle hole right there. I'm going to leave long tails, and I'm going to tie them off. I'm going to pull them to the wrong side and tie them off once I'm done. And so that's where I will see you in just a moment. So we're almost done. We only have 2 more simple steps, which is to close up these sides. So we're going to put our needle down right below our zipper coils, and we're just going to sew along this open edge here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You don't need to sew above the coils because this seam right here is already doing that for you. So just sew below them and then do the same on the other side. I tend to flip it over and then start from the bottom and then sew up to those coils. And then your zipper overlay is done. So there you have it. It's a really simple, easy zipper pocket. I'll show you how it fits my phone. It's a good size. Stays outside of your seam allowances, and no raw edges and no visible stitches on the inside at all. It's a really nice method. I really like it, and I hope you do too. For the next exterior pocket of this bag, we'll be doing the exterior slip pocket. For that, you will need your upper main lining, your lower main lining, your exterior slip pocket, and your exterior slip pocket lining. You will need to have stabilized your pieces. I've already done that. And add any woven interfacing if you are using woven. So once you get done stabilizing and interfacing your pieces, then you'll draw some of these marks on the wrong side of your exterior slip pocket lining. And then you will apply double-sided tape in that corner. This is just like we do in the Aries. Then you will remove those double-sided tape backings and fold down that corner to meet that drawn box or corner, whatever you want to call that. And you're going to do that on both sides. Now I like to give it a good press just to make sure everything stays put. Next, on the exterior, on the wrong side, you're going to draw a horizontal line on the corners here. I give you those measurements in the pattern, and then you're going to put a little piece of double-sided tape right above that. Then we're going to place these 2 pieces right sides together, and we're going to clip along that top curve. Once you get this clipped, then we're going to sew along this top curved edge here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but you're only going to sew from where this fold of this exterior slip pocket lining starts and ends, okay? In the pattern, I refer to this as the exterior and this as the lining from this point forward. And so I think I'm going to do that going forward just because it's a lot easier to say. It's less of a mouthful. But yeah, so we're going to sew from this fold to that fold using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure you backstitch well and don't sew past that. into this little corner of the exterior. So now that I've sewn that top seam there and I didn't go outside of that lining piece at all, I'm going to snip into my seam allowance along this top edge here. It doesn't have to be a lot of snips, but it does need to happen because it really gives us the best curve in which to top stitch, because it is a concave curve, which means that when we put this smaller seam allowance on this side of the seam, it needs to expand to fit. And then I'm going to take these double-sided tape backings off of the wrong side of that exterior piece, and I'm going to fold this flat edge down to meet that drawn line. And then I'm going to fold this back on itself, and it's going to take some convincing, but that's okay. I'm going to roll this between my fingers here. I'm going to slightly pull it down past this bottom edge. So I'm going to pull the lining slightly past the exterior, maybe by like 1/8 of an inch, not a ton, but just enough to really kind of get that lining to sit behind the exterior just a little bit. So I'm actually going to do that and then give it a press, and then I'll show you what I mean by that. I think it's easier to show you once it's pressed. So what I've done is I've given it a good press, and you can kind of see that from straight on, it's a little harder to see that lining. It is a contrasting lining, so that means that it's probably going to be visible in some way. It's a dark blue, tealish blue material and a white lining, so you know, we got what we got. But you can see I did kind of pull it down ever so slightly down there, and that's going to just encourage it to do what it's doing right now. Otherwise the lining would kind of ride up slightly and you would see it over this edge a little bit more than you do right now. If it is a major concern for you that you could see your lining from the outside of your bag or from the exterior, then I would suggest that you use a lining material that is not contrasting to your exterior. Have it match your exterior as best that you can, and then it will be way more easily camouflaged in your sewing. So now we're going to top stitch from edge to edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Got that top stitched, and I trimmed away any of my excess lining from my sides or from my bottom, and we can set this aside for now. And now we're going to grab our upper main lining and our lower main lining, and we're going to place these right sides together along that top straight edge, and then we will clip. So then we will sew along this top edge here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once I get that done, I'm going to flip this upper main lining up, and then I will top stitch along the lower main lining using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So I've got this seam sewn and top stitched with that seam allowance pointing towards the lower main lining. So then we're going to take our slip pocket here, and we are going to align it with that bottom edge of the lower main lining. Now you'll see that these edges match here, and that's what we want, but we're only going to clip the lining pieces together. We're not going to clip that exterior right now. We're going to hold off on doing that. So we have those lining pieces clipped and the exterior is free. So you see how these snips into your material, into your seam allowance expand. If we didn't do that, you would have a tight tension on that seam, on that top of that slip pocket there, and it would just kind of, it wouldn't be as easy to top stitch, and it's not doing what the material wants to do. You're fighting it at that point. So this just stops you from fighting it and makes it a little easier on the material itself. So now when you take this to your machine, you're going to pull in the lining, the slip pocket lining side, to meet that edge of the upper main lining here. And then you're going to start out sewing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then as soon as you kind of can, you're going to upgrade or grade up to a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And you're going to keep that around the edge of that slip pocket. And then you're going to do the same up here. You're going to pull the slip pocket in slightly to meet that edge. And then you're going to finish your seam at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And so I will show you what that looks like because it'll be easier to see the thread when I do that than it is following my finger. But essentially, you want to start and stop your stitching here with the slip pocket sides aligned with the upper main lining. And you want to start out at 3/8, grade up for 5/8 for the rest of it, and then finish at 3/8 again. So I have just sewn up that seam, and I'll show you on this side here. You can see my stitches start out at 3/8, grade into 5/8, and then grade back out to, back out to 3/8. And so now what you're going to do is trim away this lining down here. So I like to keep my trimming so that I still have an overlap of my slip pocket and the upper main lining here. I need to have something to baste it to. So now you're going to pull in these sides to match the upper main lining piece and clip. So one of the things about a slip pocket like this is that if the slip pocket is not wider than the main panel, it will cause this main panel to buckle. You need to have excess because this being on top of this means this needs more room because it's higher up and all the stuff. It works, I promise. So when you are going to sew your 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you can see as it's sitting right now, it kind of gapes open. That when you sew your 3/8 inch seam allowance with your gusset, it's going to kind of push everything together and it will lay nicely, okay? And that's exactly what we want. It's a little hard to show now before everything is sewn up, but it will have a nice, comfortable close. Now, if you really wanted to, you could apply a magnet to this. I would suggest doing it right below the seam, maybe about a 1/2 inch below this sewn seam. And you would put it one on this lining here, on the lower main lining, and one on the slip pocket lining so that they could snap together. I've designed it so that while it's sitting on the bag, for the most part, you can just use it as a normal slip pocket without it gaping wide open all the time. Obviously, if you fill it a bunch, you're probably going to have it gaping open all the time, but it's essentially a perfect little phone slip pocket, and that's what I wanted it to be. So now that we have these clipped, we're going to baste them closed using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, and then we are all done with the slip pocket. So it may be a slightly over-engineered slip pocket, that's okay. The point of doing all this work was also to make sure that we keep this pocket lining outside of your seam allowance here. And the reason why we're doing that is because if you decide to pair this with the Aries, or you decide to top stitch the gusset for one of the minimalist options, then you don't want to have 2 extra pieces of a pocket lining in your seam allowance for that. It's just a lot easier if we can keep it fully out of that seam allowance. So if you wanted to make it even smaller, you could have graded up to a 3/4 inch seam allowance if you truly want to. But as it is written and as it is sewn, it's going to nestle in right above that seam allowance on all sides here. For your alternate D-ring connector, you will need your gusset, your alternate D-ring connector piece, your rivet stabilizers, 2 D-rings, and your 2 rivets. Now I've already done the prep work here, so I have gotten my stabilizers fused on both my alternate D-ring connector and my gusset. Now keep in mind that there are 2 widths that you can use for the alternate D-ring connector. Both the 1 inch and the 3/4 inch will work on the Aries and on the Pisces, so you just choose which hardware size you would like to use. I'm going to use 3/4 inch. That's always my favorite when I'm working on the Aries or any of the Pisces add-ons. I just like that size hardware over 1 inch, but I also like that size when it comes to working with smaller bags. So you're not going to need this hardware anytime soon. This is for after you have essentially sewn up your whole bag. One of the last things that you're going to do is going to be add your D-rings and your rivets. Now keep in mind the rivet post length that you'll need will truly depend on the materials you use. The thicker materials may need longer than a 9 or 10 millimeter. It's really depending on what you chose. For me, 9 millimeter post length works well, and I always use an 8 millimeter cap because that's the size that I like. So I'm going to say it one more time that the pieces that you're cutting need to reflect the hardware size that you're using. So I'm using 3/4 inch width, so I selected those in my cut list and that's what I cut. And the same thing goes with the rivet stabilizers. You could maybe size down your stabilizer, but you can't size it up. And the same goes with your alternate D-ring connector. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to draw a line. You're going to measure into each short edge and draw a line, and then you're going to take your rivet stabilizer and center it on your piece here. And then after you get done doing that on each edge, you're going to draw a center line down the entire length of the wrong side of your alternate D-ring connector. Now that you have drawn that center line, on each side of it, you want to apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape. Now, you can apply 1/4 inch if you want to. That's completely up to you, or even more than that, but I just like to do it this way. That way I don't have to worry about trying to get it perfectly even on top of my center line. It just kind of helps make things easier when I need to fold my pieces towards the middle. So once you have that double-sided tape on there, we're going to remove the backings and fold each long edge in to meet in the center. We don't want to leave any gaps, and we just want to make sure that everything is nice and fully aligned right in the back of the center of your alternate D-ring connector. So I've got the entire length folded and it meets in the middle, and now I'm just going to top stitch a 1/4 inch away from each edge here. If you're doing a 1 inch wide connector, you're going to be top stitching in 3/8 inch from these folded edges. So again, from each long side, either a 1/4 inch or a 3/8 inch seam allowance, depending on the hardware size that you're using. So once you get this whole thing top stitch on each side, then you want to make some markings on the back of your material. Disregard my incorrect first markings, but you're going to measure from each short edge a certain amount, and then you're going to make those marks. And then you're going to also find your center. And so then between these two marks from each short edge, you're going to apply double-sided tape. I like to apply an 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape, but if you want to do more than that, you are welcome to do so. So the next part is going to be finding the center of your gusset. I like to first fold it in half, notch the top and bottom, place my ruler, and then find the center of that, and then create like a crosshair. And I do that because I want to make sure that I can align that center kind of crease on the back of my alternate D-ring connector with this horizontal mark, and then I can align the vertical center mark of the alternate D-ring connector with that as well. So I'm going to remove this double-sided tape backing, and I am going to align the center of this piece with the center of that, and just in the middle first. I'm not going to worry about getting that correct on the ends just yet. I'm going to focus only on the center. And you do have some wiggle room here and this excess length, so don't stress about it too much if it's maybe 1/8 of an inch off or so. We're going to be trimming these top down so that we have a specific amount past the top of the gusset when the bag is assembled, so then we'll work with even lengths when it comes time to attach your D-rings. So once you have gotten your material tacked down right there in the middle, I want you to use the measurements I provide to you in the pattern to measure up from each edge to just verify that you do have it accurately placed on the center. And then once you get that done, you can use your ruler to then center and adhere the rest of your alternate D-ring connector to your gusset. So now that I know that everything is really nicely centered, I'm going to measure in from each short gusset edge, that's a mouthful, and I'm going to make a horizontal mark on the right side of my D-ring connector only, and that's going to be my reference line of where I'm going to pivot. So the goal now is to start in the bottom center of your alternate D-ring connector, and you're going to sew a box around the edge using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, except for on these short edges, you're going to sew directly on top of those lines. So I'm going to start with long tails, and I am going to end with long tails, and I'm going to try and stay in the same needle hole that I started in, And then when I'm done, I'm going to pull all those threads to the back side, knot them all together, and then secure them. I know that I have shared this before, but it's worth sharing again. If you are sewing something like this or a zipper overlay and you don't really want to try and get the needle at your machine into the final hole perfectly, all you have to do is just take a little hand needle, stop one stitch before, or stop to where if you did another stitch you would go too far, and then insert that needle into that hole of the first starting stitch, and then pull it through, and now you have a nice perfectly placed final stitch. So now you can remove any of these residual markings left over from where you did your horizontal markings. And then try not to be too hard on yourself if your stitches aren't perfect. As you can see, mine are not. But keep in mind that your bag and all of those stitches will mostly be on the bottom. And you're only going to see about a third of it on the side here. And they look pretty good, right? But then when you look at the whole thing, you start to see the wonkiness appear, all right? So don't be too hard on yourself. It will turn out great. So now we're going to let this be until we finish our bag completely. And so the whole time that we sew up the Minimalist Construction or the bound top or anything, these are going to be left behind and they are going to be completely ignored, and we're not going to sew them into any seam that we shouldn't. You can pair this again with the Aries, or you can do the either minimalist options with it. It will work for all of them, and my testers did quite a few of them. But just, it's a little annoying. You have these little wings hanging out, but they are important to leave them be for now, and so please do so. So next up on the list are the card slots. So I'm going to pair them with the lower main lining. I'm going to put them on the interior of my bag, but these are very versatile. You can put them on the main panel under the flap. You can put them under the exterior slip pocket. You can put them on the inside of the wristlet pouch, of the inside of one of the Aries top zipper pockets. You can do a lot with them, so definitely give them a go. But I will say the only downfall to these guys is that it does require sewing through some double-sided tape. If that's an issue for you and your machine, I highly suggest that you keep noodle lubricant nearby. You some people use different types of needle. I don't really have that issue. Or you keep oil nearby or something. Or you can maybe glue them, but it's a tight, small fold, and so gluing may not be the best solution. But definitely, at least if you can sew through the double-sided tape and you can get through that, they're great card slots. And I really love them. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to make some lines on the wrong side of your card slots. And then just above each of those lines, you're going to apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape. So once you've applied that double-sided tape, what you're going to do is remove that double-sided tape backing and just fold this top edge down to meet that drawn line. As you can see, that's a very narrow fold there. So that's why we're going to be sewing through that double-sided tape. And then I like to clip to secure. Make sure that your fold stays consistent throughout, because we do use these edges to make sure everything is aligned when we sew the card slots on. Once you get that top edge folded down like that on all 3 pieces, then we're going to take it to the machine and top stitch along this folded edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now I like to start and end with long thread tails, and then back stitch once at the beginning and end, and then pull those thread tails to the wrong side once it's all finished, and trim them, melt them down, and then I am good to go, because I'm going to be sewing over them later. But I do like to have a back stitch in there, just because it's going to be used a lot, and yeah, I find it a little bit more secure to do that. Okay, so I've sewn these card slots kind of in assembly line style, and so now what I'm going to do is, so I guess I didn't do all of them with long thread tails, but I'll still be able to pull the starting and ending thread tails through the wrong side. I just want to be able to do that. If you have any overhangs on the edge of your card slots like that, go ahead and trim them down. So now if you were going to edge paint, you would be edge painting these short edges here on the upper card slots, just these left and right little tabs right there. Those are the only raw edges that will be seen. And then on your front card slot, just around this bottom curved edge here. Before you move on, if you decided to edge paint, you want to make sure that your pieces are fully dry before you edge paint or before you sew them on, because if you sew them on while the edge paint is still even remotely wet or a little bit pliable, then your presser foot's going to smush that down, and it could potentially remove the edge painting or get smushed onto your material. So after you get done edge painting, go ahead and apply some double-sided tape to the bottom of each of these pieces. You can also apply some to these side edges, which I'm actually going to do. And then I give you some markings for whether you are going to use your lower main lining or your upper main lining. So just follow those instructions for that measurement. I've already drawn that line. So the first thing we're going to do is take one of our upper card slots, and we're just going to remove this double-sided tape backing. And we are going to align this bottom edge of the card slot with that drawn line. Now you should take a ruler and verify that this piece is, that your piece is installed and parallel to this bottom edge down here. I know it's a little hard to see because of that white background. So I'm going to check it off camera with the ruler and then we'll move on. All right, it is nice and happy. So I'm going to now sew along this bottom edge here using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and end of this because it's going to be completely hidden and nobody's going to see it. And so why not, right? So just sew along this edge right here, and then we'll move on to the next one. So I've got that sewn on. So now I'm going to take my second one, my second upper card slot. I'm going to remove that double-sided tape backing. And now, instead of drawing another line, I'm going to just align these top edges right under that first one. So this is going to butt right up against there. I'm going to make sure it's nice and even. I'm not going to push up or anything. I'm just going to comfortably rest it below that. And then I'm going to adhere that double-sided tape right there. And then again, I'm going to sew along this bottom edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So I've got that one on, and I bet you know where I'm going with the next one, which is to remove these double-sided tape backings and apply this last card slot, the front card slot. Now, if you wanted to, you could apply some double-sided tape under these pieces right here, right along those edges. That's totally fine. You can do that if you would like. All right, so now we have a nice even edge, kind of has the appearance of a card wallet. And I'm going to adjust this just a teeny bit. There we go. That little book there is throwing me off. So now we're just going to top stitch from this top edge and go all the way around this bottom edge and bring it right back up there. And we're going to backstitch neatly at the beginning and end of this. And just like I did with the card slots, I'm going to start with longer thread tails so that I can more effectively pull it to the back. But it's not a big deal if you do not do that. Just make sure that you keep it nice and clean. That's the priority here. All right, so as you can see, I've sewn around that bottom edge there. I left long tails. Now I'm going to pull them to the wrong side and knot them and melt them, and the card slots will be done. So there you have it. Those are your card slots. Each one should hold about 2 cards. I've put some of my 3D printed credit cards in there just to show you how they fit, but each one will hold about 2 cards each. I only have 3 to my name, so I can't show you more than that, but I really like them. They're easy to pull cards out of, and minimal edge painting, and great look. And you can use them on so many parts of this bag or others. So, yep. For your interior slip pocket, you will need your interior slip pocket piece, your upper main lining, and your lower main lining. So I do touch on this in the pattern, but if you wanted to add an interior pocket to your recessed zip minimalist, this is the one that you need to do. The other zipper pockets don't really fit or work at all with the zipper placket, and this opening here has been designed to perfectly fit the zipper placket as it is designed for that add-on. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to trace this pocket opening on your lower main lining piece. Keep in mind that this is not the same width as your lower main lining, and so you'll need to do a little bit of centering here to make sure that your pocket is your pocket opening is centered on your lower main lining. So definitely use a ruler from each side to make sure that that's centered, but also you can make a center notch here and a center notch here, and just use your ruler and make sure that it's aligned here, and then also verify on each side. So once you get that traced, we're going to cut this out. Once you have that opening cut out, we're going to place these right sides together, and we're going to clip around that curve. Once you have that clipped, you're going to sew along this curved edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So you're going to start here or here, whichever one you prefer, and work your way around. As you go around these curves here, I suggest dropping your stitch length down, or you can do the whole seam with a shorter stitch length, but you want to try to have a shorter stitch length whenever you're going around curves like this, because it will kind of help your when you turn it, you'll have kind of followed that curve extremely closely with a shorter stitch length, so you'll get a nicer, smoother curve on that seam line. So once we have sewn that seam, I like to trim down my seam allowance with my pinking shears. And then around each curve, I'm going to snip into the seam allowance. I'm not going to cut my stitches at all, but I need to make some snips so that when we turn this pocket right side out, just like we did in the top curve of the slip pocket, if you did that, we need to let this seam allowance expand because it needs to be bigger than this seam right here, and currently it's smaller. So as you can see, we've had a bunch of snips there. So now what you will do is you're going to turn this right side out, or I should say wrong sides together, and you're going to need to do this number. You're going to fold that together and then kind of push the rest of this up like this. Roll it between your fingers to really work that seam out like that. This is going to want to sink in, and so you want to make sure that you fully push it out like that, and then so that you are fully kind of getting that curve that we want. Do it for both sides. So then we're going to give this a press. While you're pressing, I suggest using a tool or something to keep this pushed forward so that you can really give it a proper press and get that full curve that we want. And so then what I will do is I'm going to top stitch around this curve using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So now that this seam here has been top stitched, we're going to flip up that interior slip pocket and match up the corners with that top and bottom. Now I'm going to show you, sometimes when you sew this seam here, just the shape of it and everything wants to make it cinch in slightly. Sometimes it happens from the top stitching. As you can see, like a little bit of my lining kind of pulled out slightly there. And so that can affect how these corners want to sit with one another. So just pull it to match that side edge there, because we're going to try and force it just a little bit. It's not super important that it matches up perfectly, but it does set us up for success there if for later. So once you have those sides clipped, go ahead and give this a good press so we get a really nice crease down here on the bottom of that pocket. So now that we have everything nice and pressed and we have a nice crisp fold down there, if you are pairing this with the original Aries, I want you to cut this bottom edge open. It's going to create that opening that you're going to use to berth the bag through. That is imperative to the Aries. But if you're not doing that and you're doing one of the minimalist versions, you can just leave it closed right now. So depending on which bag you are creating, you need to follow the seam allowances for that specific instruction. So to close up these sides, if you're doing a minimalist version, you're just going to sew down using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. But if you're doing the original Aries, you're going to start at a 3/8 and you're going to grade up to a 5/8. And what that's going to do is that's going to help keep it out of your seam allowance here, and or it's going to keep it out of your gusset seam allowance, because if you catch your slip pocket lining in the seam allowance, you can't pull it out to then close it. So that's a really important step to make sure that you're grading up to do that. And once you do that, it's going to be, you're going to trim that seam allowance down, and so it'll be kind of sitting right here, and you will do your 5/8 seam allowance. It's going to kind of sit right next to it, okay? Once you get that 5/8 inch seam allowance done on each side, again, you would start at 3/8 and go up to a 5/8 inch, and you'll have that pocket opening down there. You would then follow the instructions in the original Aries interior zipper pocket to create a nice edge for for closing your bag once you have birthed it. But again, all of that is for the original Aries. If you're doing the minimalist version like I am, we're just going to sew along this edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you get done sewing those side seams, we're going to trim these seam allowances down to 1/8 inch. So at this point, if you aren't adding a recessed zipper, you would then take your upper main lining piece, align this top straight edge, center it, and sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then you would just follow the original Aries instructions and top stitch along this upper main lining. And you would do the same on the other side of the interior of your bag. But because I am pairing this with the recessed zipper, I need to hold off on doing that until I have my zipper placket ready. And so for the sake of this video tutorial, I am going to kind of not finish this slip pocket just yet. I'm going to need to kind of jump right into the recessed zipper so that I can have the zipper placket to finish both of those add-ons at once. For your recessed zip minimalist, you will need your 2 zipper placket pieces, 2 upper main linings, 2 lower main linings, your number 5 nylon zipper tape, number 5 nylon zipper pull, and your zipper end. So I touch upon this in the interior slip pocket section, but if you are if you want to add a pocket such as a slip pocket or a interior zipper pocket while also doing the recessed zip minimalist, you're going to stick with the interior slip pocket. You cannot do the original Aries zipper pocket with this particular add-on because of the way that we top stitch the zipper placket. If you're going to add stabilizers to your upper main linings, go ahead and get those fused. And then I instruct you on marks to make so that you can properly place and fuse your zipper plackets, or your zipper placket stabilizers. So once these marks have been made on your zipper placket, I want you to apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape right inside these lines. Now I give you some instructions for offsetting this tape. Is essentially you're going to put one right up against that line and you're going to put one a little bit further away from it. And that's just so that when we fold these together, that tape is going to be offset, so we're not having a double dose of double-sided tape there. We'll have essentially the equivalent of 1 strip of 1/4 inch double-sided tape. Before I move on, I wanted to remark about the marking of just the interior of the centers of your 2 zipper placket pieces. And I touch on this in the pattern, but it's just a way to make sure that your stabilizer stays on the top of your zipper placket once it's installed. So your zipper will be installed on this side, and when you fold these down and then you assemble it all into your bag, then your stabilizers will just be on top. And that's just preferred. It's just better for your stabilizer to be on the outermost material of your bag, and so that's kind of why I walk you through it, and this just kind of helps your brain know where you're supposed to be doing things. So once you have that double-sided tape applied, we're going to remove those backings and fold this short edge to meet that line that we drew that's right above this double-sided tape. So now what I'm going to do for these corners right here, Looks a little hard to see with the dark material, but I'm going to pull it up slightly, and I'm just going to snip an angled edge out of that. And that is just going to kind of help further reduce bulk. And if you do it now, you can kind of snip away more than once you sew your seam. So I do that for all of these folded edges. So now that I've done those corner snippings, I'm going to flip my pieces so that they're going to be right side up, but those center markings are still on the inner side of my zipper placket pieces. And once I do that, I'm going to verify which one is my stabilized end, and I'm going to apply double-sided tape right along that edge between that fold and this center marking. So once you get your double-sided tape applied, you need to prep your zipper. I give you instructions for this in the original Aries, and so you will need to do that. If you have another method that you want to do, you are welcome to do that, but you need to start this process with finished zipper ends similar to this. So I'm going to leave this one up here, and I'm going to focus on just this zipper placket for now. And I'm going to remove this double-sided tape backing. And I'm going to apply my zipper tape right side down, and the curved finished ends are going to point towards that center marking. So you can either fold this down and clip it, or you can apply another strip of double-sided tape. I'm going to take the double-sided tape route below those coils all the way to the end, or close to it actually, like that. And then I will remove that double-sided tape backing and fold this down. And I'm going to focus on matching up these folded edges down here at the bottom first. And then I'm just going to comfortably attach the remainder of that zipper placket. And so now what we will do is we're going to sew along this edge here using anywhere from a 1/4 inch to a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So once you have that seam sewn up, I want you to sew a second row right inside that seam allowance right next to it. And that's just going to give us a little bit more security for the stress that gets pulled on the zipper placket when you're top stitching and stuff like that. So I like to sew my zippers on my domestic whenever I can. And sometimes it really hates double-sided tape in the bottom of the zipper placket here, and it pushes it down like that. And you can see that that edge kind of went up and pushed up, and now it's no longer even. I'm not really that concerned about that because by the time that we fold everything together, it won't be a majorly noticeable difference. If that's something that happens to you, I suggest starting with this end and finishing down here, and then that typically helps that issue. But I've done this enough times, I know that in the grand scheme of things, it typically doesn't really make a huge impact on my finished zipper placket, and I just kind of let it be. So now that we have that seam sewn and that like reinforcement seam done as well, I like to snip into my zipper placket seam allowance here. I don't snip into my zipper tape, and I just trim it around where that fold is that you make for your curved top edge of your zipper. That's kind of the area in which I trim away this excess zipper tape, or seam allowance, not zipper tape. We're not cutting zipper tape. And that just helps us kind of even out that bulk there because we have 2 extra layers of zipper tape in that corner. And then I trim down these at an angle like that. And then I'm going to flip this to be wrong sides together. And then I'm going to clip this open edge. So I'm going to show you what I mean about how that like flipped up, that kind of corner of that zipper tape that went high right there didn't really have a major effect on the way that the zipper placket lays because it's only that little corner there. And so when I clip them together, I just make sure that I align them together on this corner, and when I top stitch, you'll see that it will be a different angle than what this goes to. But for me personally, it wasn't enough for me to redo that area of the seam. I just kind of let it be because it won't be a big difference. It's going to be in the underside of the zipper placket, and the top will still look really nice. And that's my priority, especially for a video tutorial. So if you left a little bit of a gap there, if you have a point turner tool like this, I like to get in there and just gently poke that out slightly. And so then I tell you to kind of tug and pull on your zipper here. And again, just like we do in other things, it's important that we express that material through that seam so that we truly get consistency and the measurements that we're going for. Because you see it kind of wants to sink in there. So you can give this a seam roll if you used woven or a material that you can press, absolutely press it. You can give it a gentle hammer, just be mindful of your coils. But we want to get this as flat as we can. It's not always possible given the materials that we're using, but it's worth a try. So now that you have that seam happily hammered and expertly expressed, we're going to sew and top stitch around each of these edges using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So I have that zipper placket top stitched. As you can see, this was that area I was talking about, how the angle of my top stitching won't really match up with that angle of the zipper placket, but I let it be. And now what I'm going to do is do this whole process for this zipper placket with the other side of the zipper teeth. So once you have finished your other zipper placket, you need to find and mark the centers of the raw edges of the zipper placket. And you also need to mark the centers of your lower main lining pieces along that top edge there, and the straight edges of your upper main linings. You also need to determine how you would like your bag laid out. So this is the back of this is my back panel, and this is going to be the front panel of my lining. And so what I want is, so when I'm looking down into my bag, okay, like this, if I have my gusset right here in the center, I want to look down and I want my zipper to open from left to right. And I want to make sure it closes to the left. And so since I have my pieces oriented how I want them here, I am going to put my zipper plackets right on top of those pieces just as they are, so I know that everything is oriented correctly. Throughout this process, your coils should be facing up. If you put your coils facing down, when you flip it up, it will still be down, and you don't want that. So I align those center markings and clip along that zipper placket. So now that you have these clipped, we're going to baste these on just like they are. And then when we come back, we will put on the upper main linings. So now that you have both of those basted on, we're going to take our upper main linings and we're going to place them right sides down on top of those zipper plackets and clip along these top edges of the lower main linings. So now we're just going to sew along these edges using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I have both of those sewn, and so now we're going to flip this up just like this. So I'll show you why we don't point this down. Because if we did, and we open the bag, the second we try to access our pocket, well, there's a zipper placket that's sewn down and in the way, and it's a lot harder to get. It essentially renders this pocket unusable at that point. And the same with the slip pocket, makes it a lot harder to access and almost pointless at that point. So definitely make sure that you are flipping your zipper placket up and you're following the instructions to top stitch along this lower main lining. So for your non-slip pocket edge, there's nothing you have to do other than press this really nice and top stitch this edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. When it comes to the slip pocket though, before we do any top stitching, we want to try and remove this bulk here from our top stitching, because when we fold it over, it does end up getting a little bulky, especially if you're using something like waterproof canvas, okay? It's not impossible to top stitch, it just is bulky. And so we don't really need to top stitch that, so we're not going to. What we are going to do, we're going to snip into our seam allowance like this, right in that gap there where we have the space between the pocket opening and the zipper placket. We're going to snip into that carefully like that so that it's free moving. And then we are going to again flip that down, and what's going to happen is all that bulk wants to point up now on those sides. It's going to hang out up here, which is fine. It's going to get tacked down in the seam allowance when we do our construction stitch. You can give it a hammer right now and make sure that everything really stays put where you want it to. Also give it a press, and then you're going to top stitch from edge to edge on this lower main lining using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So with everything top stitched now, your zipper placket and your recessed zipper is mostly finished, not all the way finished, because we can't truly finish the zipper placket until we finish the bag. But I did want to remark upon this because after you have finished this, then you're pushed to go into the, to finish your other add-ons, finish your exterior stuff, and then move on to the minimalist construction section. But when you're doing that minimalist construction, typically when we sew the Aries, we top stitch the upper main linings, which is different than what we do in the recessed zip. But now that we are top stitching the lower main lining, we need to make sure that we translate that to the upper and lower gusset lining pieces as well. So normally I would tell you to, before we did this bulk reduction on the slip pocket, and if we just let it be and we decided to top stitch all that bulk with it pointing down, I would have you reverse the normal bulk reduction that we do in the Aries. Normally you would do some vertical snips into this seam and you would flip up these edges and you would top stitch. But we're not doing that now because we don't really need to. For this side of our lower main lining seam, it's not that bulky. I think it's within the normal tolerance of most machines. It is a little bit bulky, but we really can't make it that much better than what it is, so we're going to leave it like that. So, but if you added your interior slip pocket, it also works out because the bulk is now offset even more. So this is the way that you would, it's kind of like what you do in the original Aries. You snip and you flip, and so you have this nice seam that gets meet up where the bulk is gradual here, and then when you sew it and they're right next to each other, you don't have a crazy bulky seam, but everything still is consistent in your top stitching. So that's what we want. So if you did the recessed zip minimalist, just make sure that you top stitch your lower gusset linings and not your upper gusset linings. And don't worry about doing that bulk reduction because we just don't need to. For the minimalist construction, you will need both main panels, both assembled lining panels, your assembled gusset lining, and your gusset. Now all of your add-ons should be complete at this point. If they are not, then you should get them on there as you need to. The only ones that will not be done will be your recessed zip and your alternate D-ring connector, because those have to wait until your bag is fully assembled. So the first few steps involve doing some markings as always. So you're going to need to place some horizontal marks that are 3/4 of an inch down. For the gusset pieces, you just need to draw that line all the way across the width of the wrong side of those pieces. But on these, once you make that those horizontal lines, they are reference marks for you to then place your pattern piece directly below that, and then center your pattern piece because it's going to be a little bit wider down here than it is if you were to put it at the top of the bag. So center your piece here and draw that top edge there. Trace that top edge. You want to use a non-heat erasable pen here. And then because the pattern piece has the middle marking, I'm going to go ahead and do that. But I'm also going to extend it down so that when I fold down my top edge here, I'll be able to see where that center marking is. So I'm going to do that for each of these pieces. So now that I have those marked, I'm going to set my lining pieces aside. So now I'm going to take what will be the front of my bag, and I'm going to take my gusset, and I'm going to place them right sides together, and I'm going to align this center marking on that bottom edge with the center marking on my gusset, and I'm going to staple them, or staple that center marking, and then continue to staple along that straight edge there. I don't want to staple too far into the curved areas of the main panel. I want to leave those alone for now. And then I'm going to flip this up. I'm going to match these top corners of the gusset with the top corners of the main panel. I'm going to staple on those corners and then continue to staple down these straight edges until the material starts to pull away from that curve. The second that you feel that you need to stretch your gusset to match your main panel, do not attach it anymore. We're going to do some snips first. So this is what we're going for. We have this section here that very clearly needs to be stretched to match that gusset. So we're going to take our scissors and we're going to snip into the gusset only about a 1/4 inch deep and about a 1/4 inch apart. If your material has some stretch, you probably won't have to do too many snips, but you still should have to snip. So once we get those snips in there, we're going to push the gusset down. And as we push the gusset down, it's going to expand into that curve exactly like it is doing right now. And we want to then staple that down to secure all of that, to secure that really nice curve. So now that you have everything stapled, we are going to sew around this entire outer edge here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now make sure you're back stitching well at the beginning and end. You're keeping in mind any bulk that you're going over as you sew over it. And be mindful about going around the curves. Use a shorter stitch length. Make sure you're constantly readjusting. All that good stuff to make sure that you get the best results possible. So you can see that I have sewn around that outer edge, and I also did that second stitch line that I recommend in the pattern that can help you get that smoother curve, and I incorporated my reinforcement stitches into that additional stitch line as well. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to snip into my seam allowance here on the 3/4 inch line. I'm going to trim away the straight edges of the seam allowance down to about a 1/4 inch. I'm also going to pay attention to where my snips start on where I eased my gusset, because that's where I'm going to stop trimming my straight edges. And then I'm going to remove my staples here where I couldn't trim them off. So now I'm going to use this area here that was snipped. I'm going to use that as my guide of where I need to be cutting darts. So I'm going to cut darts in this entire section here. So now we're going to repeat that whole process for the back panel. Once I get that done, I'll check back in, and then we will repeat both of those processes, the front and the back for the exterior. So I'm going to get all of that constructed using the same process that we just did and the same trimming method for the exterior. But when it comes to the lining, you want to make sure that just like in the original areas, you grade up to a 5/8 inch seam allowance once you pass that upper main lining seam, okay? So we have our lining assembled now and everything is trimmed down. I do like to use pinking shears on the lining side because if it helps out with the curves, great, but I'm not too worried about the curves sitting inside the bag perfectly. The darts are for when you're looking at this part of the curve versus when you're looking at this part. We're all going to pretend that I put my cats on the correct direction here in my gusset. I surely did not. So when somebody opens the bag, cats are upside down versus if they were to look at it this way, they are right side up. So, oh well. Okay, moving right along. Before we insert our lining into our exterior, we need to do some snips along this top edge. It doesn't have to be a lot. It shouldn't be any deeper than a 1/4 inch, but with it being a concave curve, when we fold it down, it will want to expand, and if we don't snip, it can't expand. So they don't have to be super close. There's not a ton of expansion here, but it is pretty important. Keep in mind, if you are doing a recessed zip like me, you want to make sure that your zipper tails are safely clipped out of the way throughout the next few bits of this process that we're going to do. So now that we have snipped that top edge, we're going to need to apply some double-sided tape on the right above those drawn lines that we made at the beginning of this section on both the lining and the exterior. Now, Whether you use 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch, that's up to you. You should make that judgment based off of your materials, your tape, and your machine, and how all of them jive with one another. But I prefer to use a 1/4 inch because I get a much better grip throughout this process. But if you want to completely avoid your double-sided tape, then you should move forward with 1/8 inch. So I'm going to apply this double-sided tape right over that line. And as I pass by those snip sections, I'm just going to open it up. Now that we've applied that double-sided tape, we're going to first focus on the exterior, and we're going to remove the backing. And starting in the center here, I'm going to fold down my material. And I'm going to meet that drawn line. I don't like to go all the way across the front and back. I like to just kind of do that middle section first. Then I go to my sides and I open up that gusset seam up top and fold it down there. And then I start clipping as I go, because those seams right there, they're not going to be as nice and flush as your other ones are. So when you get to this part right here, I'm sorry, it's a little overexposed. Let me see if I can adjust that. So when you get to this part right here, your snips are going to want to overlap a bit because we're going from that straight edge and we're kind of going down a bit. So let it do that, okay? Let it have a slight overlap there. Down here, it's going to expand as we need it to, okay? But right there, it's going to overlap. And so it's going to do that on each of those corners, and I want you to let it do that. Now we're going to do the same thing for the lining. So I didn't have to clip that edge with this double-sided tape and this material. It really works very well, especially with that 1/4 inch. And then a tester has suggested that we hammer these seams, and so if you're going to do that, just be careful when you are hammering down by your zipper tape, because I did accidentally slightly catch one of my coils in the hammer, and yeah, it still works. I just tested it, but be very mindful of that if you're going to do that. And so I'm going to insert my lining now into my exterior. Now make sure that it's oriented the way that you want it to, so that the back of the lining is on the back of the bag. And so now we're going to take those center markings, we're going to match them up, and we're going to align those top folded edges and then clip. And then I'm going to do the same here. So now you will align your gusset seams there like that. But it's a bit thick there, so if your clip doesn't want to go over it, just clip right before and right after it, like that. And then repeat that for the other gusset seams. So now that you have those gusset seams aligned and your center aligned, you're going to go through and you're going to align the rest of the edges and re-clip them. So now that you've clipped everything, I want you to go back and double check that your exterior is level with your lining. So now that I have that top edge clipped, we're going to sew around that entire top edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now this is a drop-in lining and it's a final top stitch, which means that if you have a free arm option on your machine, or you have a cylinder arm, it's way easier to do that with those. If you have a flatbed, you're probably well versed in how you need to do this step. Either you need to sew with it like this so that your bottom thread will be on the exterior. If you need to do that, make sure you have perfect tension. If not, then you need to have your bag flipped inside out for that process. So if you're going to do that, make sure that you double check your top folds here to make sure everything's still aligned after you flip it right side out. So I will do that. I'll probably bring you to the machine with me as we top stitch on the cylinder arm, and then we will come back and we'll finish our alternate D-ring connectors and our recessed zipper. So here we are. You are now on my phone, and so if there's a change in quality or sound, here we are. So I start out here under my alternate D-ring connector, and I'm going to stitch forward once, and then I'm going to backstitch, because I don't need to leave long pretty tails here, because I'm not going to be pulling them to the back side and knotting them or anything. They're going to be completely hidden under my alternate D-ring connector. Since I have my recessed zipper, I'm going to make sure that that gets pointed down as I sew, so I don't accidentally sew over it. And I'm going to just sew along this top edge. As I traverse over some of these bulky corners, I'm just going to be mindful of that and walk it slowly. And as I go, I'm going to keep making sure that everything stays adjusted as I want it to. If I have zipper tails, I'm going to make sure that I know where they are inside my bag when I'm getting towards the end where they are, because I don't want to accidentally sew them into my seam and have to redo my top stitching. As I finish up my seam, I'm just going to backstitch and I'm done. So that is our final top stitch. Looks pretty good to me. On the inside too. Alright, let's get these threads trimmed and then we will finish up our bag at the cutting table. So there is my final top stitch. It looks really good. I'm very happy with it. So now that we've done that final top stitch, you're going to resume in the alternate D-ring connector section on, what step is it? Step 19. And it's going to have you trim this excess down to a specific length. So I'm going to do that and then we'll check back. So I've trimmed off that excess. One of the testers brought up a good point that, if you are concerned about those cut stitches unraveling, then you can definitely place some fabric glue or fray check on there. Because we're getting ready to fold this down and then fold it down again, it's not really going to unravel at any point. It's not going to be exposed to anything that's going to unravel it over time, especially if your tension was correct. So that's up to you. If you would like to do that, please feel free to do so. So now what we're going to do is we're going to find a good spot between this top edge and this horizontal stitching right here. It's going to be about the halfway point, and so I'm going to go ahead and make my mark there. If you were doing this on a bound top, you'd want to place it below that top binding. So now I'm going to punch through that hole and through all layers. Alright, so I have that hole punched through. I'm going to do the same on the other side. So after you've punched those holes, I tell you to measure into this excess a certain amount, and then place a little bit of double-sided tape and fold this raw edge down to meet that drawn line. Give it a clip to hold it temporarily. So once we folded them both down, we're going to insert our D-ring. And I like to make sure that it's sitting kind of right on top of my gusset there, and then I'm going to fold this down. And I'm going to make sure that it's not too tight. And remember, when we set our rivet, it's going to pinch it down even further, which is going to make it even tighter. So be mindful of that and don't make it too tight, but you also don't want to make it too loose either. You really need to work and find that sweet spot. And so now that it's folded over like that, you're going to take a marking pen and you're going to press through to transfer that hole. Now you're probably going to have to press really hard because you have a lot of bulk and a small amount of a pen tip to travel through. So I just pressed it through as hard as I could, and I was able to transfer that marking. And so now I'm going to punch this hole. So now that you have all your holes punched, you can insert your rivets. So once you have your rivet in there and you've caught all layers, go ahead and set that rivet. Got that rivet set. And now I'm going to do that on this side as well. So those are your alternate D-ring connectors. And now we will insert our zipper pull onto our zipper tape. Make sure that when you have inserted your zipper pull on, when you're done with it, you have a nice straight edge. Because if not, then your zipper will be off. Then I want you to trim down your zipper tape to your preference. Typically I chop off about 1.5 inches or so. Once you've done that, I want you to melt that top edge. For the cut end of your zipper tape, I want you to take this edge and fold it to the coils and then behind the coils. Same with this, to the coils and then behind the coils. And then I like to use my lighter and kind of carefully pinch that, and that kind of holds that for me a little bit. And then I'll put a clip on there for a moment. So now I will take my glue and put some into my zipper end. You don't need a lot. If you put too much in there, it will seep out. And then I'm going to drop my zipper end and pick it up and put it into, and put the zipper tape into the zipper end like this. And then I kind of like to pull that zipper back out slightly so that it's not really going too far into that tape. And then I will screw on, or screw that in place. So that is your recessed zip minimalist. You have your front slip pocket, your back zipper pocket, your alternate D-ring connector, your recessed zipper pocket, your interior slip pocket, and your card slots. So many good things in one. So now you need to give your bag a really good press and make your strap, and you are good to go. For the wristlet pouch, you will need 2 main panels, 2 main zipper linings, your wristlet strap, 4 grommet stabilizers, your number 5 nylon zipper tape, your zipper tab, and your number 5 nylon zipper pull. You'll also need 2 grommets, so each one will have a male and a female piece, your 1.25 inch circle gate ring, a rivet, and a 3/4 inch wide swivel snap hook. At the beginning of this section, I don't have you fuse your stabilizers right away because we want to put in our grommet stabilizers first. But if you have quilted your main panel, that's okay. We can hold off on that. The amount of stabilizers on your quilted main panels ends up making it pretty much okay. There shouldn't be an issue here. We're still going to apply the grommet stabilizers, but it's okay to do it after the fact. So I just wanted to show you the 2 designs that are included in the Pisces pack. It's essentially the same design except for you extend your lines on one side and not on the other for like the woven effect, such as this one. And you will not do that on this one, and you get a chevron design. So I do provide you all the measurements for these 2 designs, and they work well with the Aries because you don't have to worry about snipping into your quilted sections down here in those corners where you'll be doing some snipping. And it looks really nice when it's finished because it matches up nicely with that bottom edge of the Aries and all that good stuff. If you're going to quilt your main panels, there's a couple things that you need to know. One is that you should not pair them with any exterior pockets. And 2, you should do it before you do anything else. So when it comes to the grommet stabilizers, it's a little confusing when I give you instructions because you're like, wait, what? So I need you to separate your pieces into 2 piles, and that would be your main panel front and your main zipper lining back, and then your main panel back and your main zipper lining front. And that's because when we put all these pieces together, and they're going to be opposite one another, right? We just want to make sure that all those grommet stabilizers will stay on the correct side, because the grommets are going to be right next to each other. So if we kind of mix this up, you're going to end up with one grommet stabilizer over here and one over here, and vice versa for the various pieces. So take a moment, make sure you have everything as you need it to be, because we do have a designated front and back for this pouch due to the grommets and needing to stabilize and place those together. So once you've made those marks for the grommet stabilizers, I just want you to take your stabilizer and align it with that corner that you drew and fuse it. So now that I have my grommet stabilizers fused, I separate them into two piles, and I just do that by making sure that the stabilizers I have, when I place them right sides together, match up. And that is going to show me that I have both of my back panels here and my front panels here. So this pouch is designed to open from left to right. You cannot do it the other way around because of the way that the grommet placement and everything is installed. So for your zipper tape, you will need to finish the ends of your zipper tape as I instruct in the original Aries, put your zipper pull on, and then install your zipper tab. Now I do tell you to cut your zipper tab differently than what I do in the original Aries, and that is because it just kind of makes everything sit a little bit better by changing that length ever so slightly. So make sure you do that. Once you get all that done, I want you to put double-sided tape along each edge of the front and back of your zipper tape. So once you have applied that double-sided tape to both sides of your zipper, I want you to go and find the centers of each of your pieces here. So for this next part, we're going to be working with the front main panel. And when you are looking at it from the right side, your grommet stabilizer should be on the left, should be right here. And so now you want to take your zipper and you want to put it right sides together with your main panel, and your zipper should be pointing towards this grommet stabilizer. Then I want you to remove this topmost double-sided tape backing and align that center marking on your zipper tape with the center marking on your main panel, and just adhere that center spot first. Once you have that adhered, then just carefully adhere the rest of the zipper to that curve of the main panel. So now I'm going to baste this in place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Your zipper end is going to want to continue to go straight. You need to keep it nice and clipped along that curve. So it will take some coaxing, but this is what you want. You want it to stay in line with that curve, okay? Now we're going to remove this double-sided tape backing, and we're going to center our main zipper lining with that center marking. I'm going to adhere the rest of it right along that top edge. Now your double-sided tape does not extend to these corners, so if you want, you can add a clip up there just to keep it nice and stable. So now you're going to sew along this top edge from corner to corner using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We're not going to do any bulk reduction here in these corners because we don't need to. I've just found that the basic way of sewing a pouch is the best way. It's just getting the right zipper length and getting the correct seam allowances. So we're going to again sew from here to here. It's important that you get that full 3/8 inch seam allowance though, because that's what's going to give you that nice smooth zipper on this concave curve. Now before we move on, stop and double check that your seam is consistent and smooth. And if it is, then you can turn these wrong sides together. And then we're going to press this top edge really well. So now that we have this pressed, we are going to flip that lining up, and we're going to make sure that our seam allowance goes under the main panel. We don't want any seam allowance on the lining side. So we're going to sew along this seam using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. When you start and end, you're going to need to kind of angle your work slightly so that you are truly getting that proper shape as you are top stitching for that curved zipper. So I've got that top stitched, and you'll see on the back side here, my lining is completely free. So now we want to repeat this whole process that we just did on the back panels now. So now that both sides are sewn and top stitched, you can see everything looks really nice. Nice smooth zipper there. Even with the quilted design, and you'll have a change in tension on your materials and stuff like that. As long as you're hitting that full 3/8 inch seam allowance and your tension is correct, you should have a nice smooth zipper. So in the pattern, I give you measurements to place small marks for your grommets. And so those are really important that you try really hard to get them as evenly placed as you can, so that when you install your grommets, everything lines up as it needs to. And it's very important that you do this on the end that separates and not on the end with the zipper tab. Once you have your grommet markings on your bag, close your zipper a little bit and place your exterior and lining pieces right sides together. Now I like to staple my seams here because I think that it keeps everything as accurately placed as I can make it. But you are welcome to use clips. And we're going to line up those markings right there on those edges so that they're nicely aligned. Make sure you peek in and double check that everything is aligned there. Then I am going to just staple around those edges. Make sure everything is happy. I'm going to peek in and see how my quilting lines are aligning. They look to be pretty good. And then I'm going to keep stapling around. Then I'm going to staple along these sides and curves here, and I'm going to leave a gap of about 5 inches or so along this bottom edge here. So I've continued to staple along my lining. And then I marked for an opening here, and it's about 5 inches long. You can make it a little bit wider if you want. I don't suggest making it any smaller. But once you make those opening marks, those vertical lines for where your opening will be, on the side that you will start sewing in. So when you start sewing and you put your needle down, I want you to make a horizontal mark that is 3/8 inches up from this bottom edge. And the reason for that is because we are going to do some grading here differently than we normally do. So we're going to grade both right when we hit these seams of the exterior and along this bottom edge. And the reason for that is because, I don't know if you've ever made a pouch like this, but when you go to close up the bottom, if you pinch the bottom of your bag, you can feel your lining floating in there. And that's because we normally grade and use a bigger seam allowance on our lining, and when we include that all the way through the bottom and then we pinch it together and sew it closed, now we've created an even bigger seam allowance on that bottom, right? So because that top stitching, when we place them right sides together, ends up adding to the seam allowance at the end of it. So if we start out at the smaller seam allowance and then once we hit our curve we grade up to our bigger seam allowance, then what happens is when we're all done and we put those things right sides together, that final top stitch we do will then have the lining sit nicely right above the bottom of the bag and not be floating. We're not going to have a huge seam allowance. We're going to have the seam allowance that we were aiming for on the bottom. That's kind of hard to explain and kind of hard for you to wrap your head around, but if you ever decide to give it a try doing this in a larger seam allowance across the bottom and see if you can feel where your lining doesn't fully hit the bottom of your bag, and then compare that to this method of where we grade this bottom down to our normal 3/8 inch seam allowance, and just see if you can feel the difference. Trust me, I felt it, it bothered me, and that's the reason why I do this extra work. So when you start sewing your 3/8 inch seam allowance, along this straight edge, you're going to start and you're going to continue that. And the second that you hit this curve, you're going to grade up to about a 5/8. And you're going to keep that 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way up until you are getting close to this 3/8 inch seam allowance, or until you hit this exterior seam here, the zipper seam, then you're going to grade back to a 3/8 inch seam allowance and continue on your 3/8 inch all the way around your exterior. And then as soon as you hit this seam here, you're going to grade back up to a 5/8, right about there, and then continue that down until you get right past that seam, and then drop it back down to a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you'll be good to go. We're going to start sewing right here. We're going to sew vertically up to that 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to go over. And the reason for that is because this helps you kind of pull this lining in really nicely for closing it up. And the reason why you don't make the marking on this side is because by this point you'll have an edge in which you're following on your machine, so you don't really need to mark that 3/8 inch. If you want to, you absolutely can, but it's not necessary. So hopefully all of that made sense, and so I will go and sew all this, and then I'll show you all my seams as I go, and then we will do some trimming and turning. So now that I've sewn this seam, you can see a little better what I did. I'd like to say that my drawing wasn't far off my eyeballing of that seam allowance, but I sewed vertically, backstitched, and then as soon as I hit that 3/8 inch marking, I followed the curve using grading up to that 5/8 inch, kept that 5/8 inch going there, and then graded down to that 3/8 inch seam allowance. And all along the exterior, it's hard to see because my thread matches, but I used a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then once I hit this exterior, or this zipper seam, I essentially angled my work and graded right back up to that 5/8, and then continued it down. Not a very smooth, pretty curve, but it works. And then to my opening mark, and aiming to reach 3/8 by that point, and then vertically stitched and backstitched. And that's how I ended my seam. So when it comes time to trimming, I want you to leave this area be. Don't trim it down. It's going to be easier to do what we need to do when we have a bigger seam allowance. We're going to trim, so essentially going to start here and trim around this curve here using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Don't cut into your vertical stitching at all. On the exterior of your bag, you're going to trim your straight edges down to about a quarter inch seam allowance, and you're going to cut darts along this curve as always. So I have my exterior trimmed as I've called for, and same with my lining. So now I can birth this bag. All right, so I'm happy with those curves. So now what we're going to do is, the reason why you don't push this zipper tab out just yet is because I want you to reach inside your bag. I want you to open this seam allowance, and I want you to pinch it together like this. Make sure your lining stays open, and then fold it down. Get it nice and flat, and then push the whole thing out like that. Now once you do that, your seam allowance is going to poke out just a little bit right there. I want you to push that in and push all that seam allowance we just folded together up, and then kind of work it as flat as you can, and you will get a nice corner right there. You can further push it out. You want this part to be exposed, but you don't want the edge of that seam allowance to be overexposed. So it does take a little bit of finagling, but it's really not that difficult. It's made easier by the fact that you have laid those seam allowances nice and flat. So then we'll have a nice corner like that on our finished bag. We're going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to reach into that lining, open up this seam allowance like that, and fold it down. For this one, you can tug on it slightly from the outside. I see my mark was trying to get wiped off. Let me remark it. Okay. And so once you get that folded down and the seam allowances are in the right spots, put a clip on there. That way we make sure that throughout the process of pressing and closing your bag, you don't accidentally undo all that hard work. So now we're going to pull this lining out. And when we go to push it back in, we take our fingers and we push on those vertical seams, and it kind of helps to push all that material down evenly so that we get the consistent seam allowance we need. So then we're going to go and fold this down like this and press this nice and flat so that you have a nice crisp edge in which to close your bag. Once you've pressed those edges down, I want you to clip it together and then just top stitch along these edges using a 1/8 inch seam allowance just along that opening there. If you really wanted to, you could hand stitch this closed. I'm not too worried about it, but that's totally up to you if you would like to do that. So now that we've sewn that edge, we're going to insert our lining back into our pouch. Going to push our lining down into those curves as much as we can. Like that. And we're going to give it a press. Now, I did use removable ink for my lines or for my dots, so I'm going to redo them here before I press because I don't want to lose my marks here. So now we are going to press this lining as smooth as we can. We want to get it as close to and as snug into the lining as possible so that when we punch our grommet holes, we don't have our lining ride up, because if it rides up, it's going to affect the functionality of this zipper. So I'm going to give everything a good press. We'll close it up, take a look at it, and then we'll work on getting our grommets installed. So now what we'll do is we'll take our grommet and we will center it over our marking like that. See if I can zoom in. I'm going to take our grommet and center it over our marking and then trace inside the grommet hole, okay? So I have my circles marked, and I'm only going to punch one hole at a time. I'm going to start with my first grommet on my front, and I'm going to install that grommet there. And then I will punch my hole for my second one and install my grommets here. And the reason why I do that is because if your lining shifts in the process of cutting the hole and setting the grommet on the first side, you don't want to have already punched your hole on the back side and then your lining shifts and then it's overly stretched and things aren't working out for you. So it's best to do it one side at a time. So I will do that off screen and then I'll show you the first grommet and then I'll repeat that process for the second. So I have my hole punched, I have my female grommet on the inside, and I have my male grommet going on the exterior. I'm going to get them fit together and then get them set. So I have that grommet set nicely on both the inside and outside. It's a force fit grommet. I really like them. They're very easy to set and they look really nice. So now I'm going to repeat this process on the back side. I'm going to get my hole punched and insert and set my grommet. Okay, both grommets are installed. So now I can take my circle ring here. Now 1 inch will not work for this. You need the 1 1/4 here. And then it takes a little bit of finagling once you get it on there, but it quickly gets on there. Zipper on up. Now we can work on our wristlet strap. On the wrong side of your wristlet strap, you want to draw a center line down the length. This is a 3/4 inch strap, so we're going to make this mark at 1.5 inches. Then we're going to place some double-sided tape along this length. I like to use 1/8 inch for this. Then we're going to remove those double-sided tape backings and fold over to meet just outside of that center line. We want to leave that little bit of a gap like that. So now that you have left that gap there in the middle, we're going to apply some double-sided tape along one side. You can use a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch. I normally like to use 1/8 inch on the other side, or on the inside, and then a 1/4 inch here. and I place it right down that center. Remove that backing and fold in half to meet. So if you need to, you can further clip that double folded edge, but if not, you can now go and sew around all 4 edges of your wristlet strap using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I would like to report that I risked it for the wristlet. I've just won bob and chicken top stitching my strap, which you should never do, but I did and I won, so Okay, so now I'm going to trim down these edges to be nice and even. On each short end of your wristlet strap, I instruct you to do some marking, so go ahead and do that and then get those holes punched. So once you have punched those holes, now you're going to insert your swivel snap hook, and you're going to bring up this short edge to match that first hole. I'm going to insert my rivet first so that I can kind of keep things nice and aligned. Then I'm going to put that in there through there. My rivet is a little short, but this material compresses a lot, so it will be fine. I'm going to push that through, get the other end of my rivet cap on with some finagling, and then I'm going to get it set. Once I set my rivet, then we can put on a snap hook, or I'm sorry, a strap end if we want, and if not, then we just snap it onto our wristlet and we're all done. So I do note in the pattern that if you're using thicker hardware, or your materials are thicker or anything like that, then you may want to adjust these markings. So I can't really write in measurements that accommodates all materials and all hardware sizes, so just use your best judgment and make those adjustments as needed. So now that you have your wristlet done, you can snap it onto your circle ring there, and you are all done. However you transformed your Aries, I hope you love it, and I hope you try it again and again and again. The possibilities are endless. Feel free to tag me at Knotted Threads Co. on all platforms. I would love to see your work. Thanks again for watching, and happy sewing!